interfered with in any way. She sighed and sat down in an easy chair. She'd get one of the aides to fetch Helen when the next song was over. The women in the choir outnumbered the men 2-to-1, she noticed, just as they did in the room at large. Although it was a man who spoke for them, their conductor was a woman. Her demeanour was authoritative enough, and her voice, which could be heard above everyone else's, was clear and pleasant. But Winifred found her conducting technique baffling. The woman did nothing but point spiritedly at the choir with the index fingers of both hands, in time with the music. It was all kind of beside the point anyway, Winifred decided, since hardly any of the singers ever looked at her. Even though they were all holding music books, they didn't look at them either. They were singing School Days, and they knew the words off by heart. No, they weren't looking at the conductor, and they weren't looking at their music. They were looking at the inmates of Shady Acres, their eyes darting among them, furtive glances sliding off them. And Winifred knew exactly what they were thinking, because she couldn't help it. She had that thought, too, every single time she had occasion to come here. And that thought was, God help me, I'm never going to end up in a place like this. But she didn't mean exactly that. What she meant was, please, God, don't let me need to end up in a place like this. Not that there was anything wrong with Shady Acres, for those who did need such a place. It was bright, comfortably furnished, well-maintained, prettily landscaped. The staff were capable, usually cheerful, tolerant. Taught to the tune of a hickory stick, warbled the choir, as Winifred watched a man at the fringe of the audience working hard to remove one of his socks. He was loosely belted into a wheelchair. He'd gotten his right slipper off and was now working on the sock. He was completely absorbed in this activity, despite having little success. Either his fingers weren't strong enough to push the sock down over his ankle, or his mind had forgotten what movements were necessary to achieve this. You were my bashful, barefoot beau, caroled the choir. What the hell's going on here? Winifred turned, startled. An old man, red-faced and furious, standing in the entrance to the lounge, lifted his cane and waved it at the choir. Winifred recognized him. Reginald Dutton. "What the hell are you people doing here?" he shouted. Their voices trailed away and they gawked at him. He had the attention of everyone in the room, except the man trying to take off his sock. Helen Mitchell, having turned around like everybody else, spotted Winifred and waved. She murmured something to the woman sitting next to her, patted her shoulder, and stood up. Winifred noticed that she had her handbag with her. "Get the hell out of my living room," hollered Reginald Dutton, shaking his cane and moving directly in front of Winifred's chair. Several aides materialized. "Come on now, Reginald," said one of them, a young man no taller than Reginald, but considerably bigger around. "That's not very hospitable." Winifred peered around Reginald and saw that Helen had almost extricated herself from the assemblage, so she got to her feet. "Excuse me, Mr. Dutton," she said. "I've got to get by here." He whirled around and stared up at her. "How do you know my name?" "You used to ride in my taxicab sometimes." "What do you mean, I used to? You mean I don't any more?" "You haven't for a while," said Winifred, glancing at the aide. "Since when?" Reginald Dutton demanded. "Why?" "Well, I don't know. I can't remember." "I know," he said. "I know." Exhaustion settled upon his face. "I know," he said dully. He was looking into Winifred's eyes. Then he turned away. "I want a cup of tea," he said, shaking off the aide's hands. "Get these people out of here," he ordered, gesturing at the choir. He limped slowly out of the lounge, leaning heavily on his cane, and disappeared down the hallway. Winifred and Helen watched him go. "This place is a madhouse," said Helen. "Come on." She headed for the automatic doors, and Winifred followed. "It's the ones whose minds are going, or gone," said Helen in the cab on the way to the hairdresser. "They're the ones you don't like to consider." She was a short woman, and she used to be overweight, but moving into Shady Acres had caused the pounds to melt away. Winifred wondered if the food was bad, or if the place just took away a person's appetite. "How are you doing in there, anyway?" said Winifred. "I've got my own room," said Helen, gazing out the side window, holding her handbag. "And some of us get together to play bridge or canasta." She turned to Winifred. "It's important to get out, very important to get out." "I could see that it would be," said Winifred, pulling up in front of Arnold's styling salon. I get out several times a week, once to get my hair done, a couple of times to shop. Every Sunday Cassandra and I have dinner somewhere. That's good, said Winifred. It's good to keep busy. What time should I pick you up? About 3:15, I think. Okay. Can you manage the door? Okay. 3:15 it is. See you then. She waited until Helen was safely out of the cab and in the salon. Helen waved through the window, and so did Arnold, standing behind her. Winifred grinned and waved back. At home she was surprised and pleased to see that one whole wall of her house was now sunny yellow. Last week the window people had come and replaced all of the windows that weren't double-glazed. What with that and the new siding, she could count on much lower heating bills this winter. She went inside, thinking she just had time to get a tub of laundry going and maybe write up her shopping list before taking Helen home. She had the washer loaded and was dumping a scoop of detergent on top of it when she heard the front door open. "Winifred, it's me," Naomi called. Winifred, irritated, looked at her watch. "In here," she called back. "The laundry room." She closed the lid of the washer and turned on the water. "Hi," said Naomi from the doorway. Her face was less pale than usual, and her eyes were extremely bright. "You were right about the play school," she said. Frances Cox had told Winifred about 2 new kids who'd started coming to her 3-year-old summer play school. They were the right ages to be Naomi's kids. "Maybe you should stroll by one day and have a look," Winifred had suggested to Naomi. "Satisfy yourself that they're okay, if they turn out to be yours." "Was I?" said Winifred now, beginning to smile. "Good. Did you get a peek at them, then?" Naomi stood aside, half turned around, and made a little beckoning motion. 2 children emerged from the dimness of the hall. The girl looked to be about 5 years old, the boy a year or so younger. "This is Tiffany and Walter," said Naomi. "Kids, this is Winifred." Winifred stepped back and leaned against the washing machine. She fixed her attention on the sound of the running water. "This," she said to Naomi and to the world at large, "is not what I had in mind." "Say hello to Winifred," said Naomi, smoothing long strands of hair away from Tiffany's forehead. "Hello," said the children obediently. They were wearing jeans and sneakers and T-shirts. Naomi looked at Winifred, smiling. "I only need to keep them here for a couple of days," she said, "until I find a place of my own." Wednesday, July the 28th, 1993. The report I am about to make, when considered along with 4 earlier reports submitted over the last 7.5 weeks, suggests to me that we in Sechelt are experiencing a virtual epidemic of break-and-enter offences. For the 5th time I have interviewed a victim, in this case 2 victims of robbery. What we have here, in my opinion, is no garden-variety burglar. First, the most recent of the crimes. On Tuesday, July the 27th, yesterday, Mrs. Patricia Berkson discovered missing from her home a sterling silver service for 12, consisting of 80 pieces, in total, including serving pieces. She opened the large chest in which they were kept and found it empty. She was, as she expressed herself to me, dumbfounded. Despite the evidence of her eyes, she actually looked for the silverware, looked all over the house, as if she or someone else might have absently emptied the chest of the silverware and put it someplace else and forgotten all about it. She did not, of course, find it. She informed me that she had been going to clean it in preparation for a family reunion. The silver was seldom used, she said. The last time she had used it was at Christmas time. She would have used it at Easter time ordinarily, but this year she and Mr. Howard Berkson spent Easter with relatives in Vancouver. The silver could have been stolen then, any time between Christmas and the date she noticed that it was gone. In the middle of our first interview, Mrs. Berkson suddenly blanched. She had some jewelry, too, she said, which she kept in a box in her closet. She hurried away, followed by her husband. They returned less than a half an hour later. The jewelry, too, was gone. This jewelry consists of 1 3-strand pearl necklace with matching earrings and an amethyst ring surrounded by diamonds. Close examination of the premises yielded no clues as to how this robbery might have been carried out. I add here the report made yesterday morning by Mr. Alastair McNeil, who, upon investigating noises in his house on Monday night, discovered that the locking device on a pair of sliding glass doors had been dismantled. It is his opinion, with which I concur, that he unwittingly interrupted, when making a trip to the toilet, a theft in progress. Close examination of his premises yielded no evidence as to the identity of the perpetrator. I respectfully suggest that the robberies of Reginald Dutton, Earl Chan, the Seashelt Public Library, Mary Jefferson, and Mr. and Mrs. Berkson, and the attempted robbery of Alistair MacNeil might well have been executed by the same perpetrator, and ask permission to devote all my energies and attention to this case, to the exclusion of other duties. Signed, Constable Garnet Mike Michelson. Chapter 18. "Can you rent Dragnet, do you know?" Alberg asked Sokolovsky on Wednesday. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "The series, not the movie." "I don't know," said the sergeant. "Why?" "We're going to have to take drastic action here." Alberg tossed Mike Michelson's most recent reports across his desk towards Sokolovsky. "I thought if we locked him in a room with Joe Friday for a few days, maybe he'd get the message." "I'll talk to him again," said Sokolovsky, reading. "Jesus." Alberg stretched, wincing, and massaged the small of his back. "Tell him no, he cannot devote all his energies and attention to the robberies." He put his glasses back on and peered at the paperwork. "When I'm not here," he thought, "this stuff copulates and achieves instant procreation. He can spend all his leftover energy and attention there, though," he said. "I think he's right. It does sound like it's one guy." Isabella knocked. "How many hours left until you leave?" 2 days, said Alberg promptly. "I'm not counting the hours, Isabella, not yet. Is Dutton out there with his damn sign?" Isabella shook her head. "Nope. I'm here to find out when the sergeant plans to take his holidays." "I'm not taking any," said Sokolovsky. "That's not allowed," said Alberg. "Yeah, well, I don't care if it's allowed or not. I got no place to go, nothing I want to do. I'm not taking any leave. Give mine to somebody else." Isabella looked from one to the other. "Let me know what happens," she said, and disappeared. Alberg looked at Sokolovsky intently for a minute. "You need to get out of here." He stood up. "Come on." "I don't need to," said the sergeant plaintively. Alberg went around his desk. "Come anyway." He left his office and headed for the parking lot, and Sokolovsky reluctantly followed. Alberg took them to Earl's, where they sat at a table by the window. Alberg ordered 2 coffees from the new waitress. It was late afternoon, and there weren't many other people in the place. Alberg saw no sign of Earl. He recognized a teller from the Bank of Montreal occupying one of the stools at the counter, reading one of the morning papers. A bearded man wearing coveralls sat at a table near the door with an elderly woman, maybe his mother. At a table where smoking was allowed, 4 mill workers from Port Mellon were playing cards. "Okay, Sid," said Alberg. "What's up?" Sid looked at him bleakly. Alberg leaned over the table and said it again. "Sid, what's up? Come on." "I don't think I can talk about it." "It's serious," said Alberg. "That much I can see. I don't want to pry into your private life, Sid, for Christ's sake. You know that." "I know. But—" He broke off when the waitress approached with their coffee. "Thanks," he said to her. "No problem." When she had retreated, Alberg went on quietly, "But, Sid, you can't go on like this." The sergeant's unhappiness had been growing for weeks. Isabella had noticed it first. "Are you sick?" Alberg had heard her say to Sokolovsky, who hadn't immediately replied. "You sure look sick." "I'm not sick," Sid had snapped. Alberg had turned from the coffee machine. While he protested his wellness, there was pain in the sergeant's voice. Alberg had looked carefully at Sid Sokolovsky and seen that he had grown less enormous and that his face was drawn, noticed the air of distractedness about him. Sid had removed his service cap and placed it on the empty chair next to him. Now he rubbed his close-shaven head with both of his huge hands. "I know I gotta do something. I'm starting to forget stuff." "I noticed." "I'm really sorry about that, Staff." He sounded miserable. "I've never forgotten to go to court in my life before, never." "I know, Sid. It's very humiliating." "I know." "Is somebody sick? Elsie? One of the kids?" But the sergeant was shaking his head. "Is it money, then?" "No, Karl." He sounded indignant. "It's nothing like that." He picked up his coffee cup, but put it back in the saucer without drinking. "It's a personal thing. an emotional thing. Okay, said Alberg, nodding. Okay. So how about... Do you think you need to see the shrink? Sokolovsky considered it. As Alberg studied his face, he thought he saw a flash of hope rise and fade. Not me. Why not you? It's okay for the rest of the world to need a shrink from time to time, but not for you, is that it? How come you think you've got to be stronger than everybody else just because you're bigger than everybody else? Sid was shaking his head. That's not what I meant. The door of the cafe flew open, and a small, red-faced, middle-aged woman burst in. She was wearing a short-sleeved cotton dress with polka dots and open-toed sandals. I mean, Sokolovsky was saying, it's not me who needs the shrink, it's Elsie. What's the matter with Elsie? The woman was gripping the edge of the counter, getting her breath, when the waitress emerged from the kitchen. "Where are the kids?" she yelled at the waitress in a faded but still recognizable North Country accent. "What have you done with our Keith's kids?" Sokolovsky glanced at her, then back at Alberg. I haven't said this out loud to anybody, Karl." "Uh-huh," said Alberg. Earl opened the door from the kitchen and peeked out. The waitress folded her arms and stared stonily at the older woman. "Your Keith's an asshole. You know he doesn't deserve to have those kids." Alberg turned in his chair and watched the two of them. The whole cafe was watching them. Earl came through the door. "What's the trouble?" "Elsie," said Sokolovsky, his eyes on the tabletop. "She says she wants to be on her own for a while." The older woman pounded the counter with her fist. Alberg noticed she wasn't carrying a handbag. "You give me back those kids!" she shrieked, pounding. "Tart! Whore!" Earl came around the counter to stare up at her, horrified. The bearded man in coveralls stood up, uncertain, and looked around for help. Alberg reached across the table and laid a hand on Sokolovsky's arm. "Sid, shit, I'm damn sorry, but I think we're needed here." "Her son's an asshole," said Naomi, breathless and disheveled, "and she's no better." "That kind of talk isn't going to get us anywhere," said Alberg. He and Sokolovsky were sitting at one of Earl's tables with Naomi and her mother-in-law. "Let's see if I've got this straight. You and your husband lived in Vancouver. 2 months ago he left you and took the kids and came here to live with his parents." "Yeah." "Is this a legal separation?" Sokolovsky asked. "No, for God's sake, he just took off. Took off for here, this hole-in-the-wall town. Just took off," she said, her voice rising. "The damn druggie, with my damn kids." "And why?" "Tell them why he took off, missy," said Clara Hellier, patting her graying hair into place. "Tell them about your whoring down on Granville Street." She pointed a finger at Naomi, nodding her head, looking at Alberg. "And what about your damn son?" said Naomi. "Keith, the druggie? What kind of a guy is that to bring up kids?" "Keith doesn't do that any more," said Clara Hellier furiously, with a glance at the uniformed sergeant. "And he gets help bringing up his kids from me and his dad." The rest of Earl's patrons were listening with keen interest. "Okay," said Alberg. "I think we need some help with this situation." "We got to get the social services people in on it," said the sergeant. "We don't need no government intervention," Clara snapped. "Keep the government out of it." "I'm afraid we can't," said Alberg. "They'll have to help decide what's best here, for your grandchildren." "And meanwhile, I want them." Clara pounded the table. "Now!" She whirled on Naomi. "You go get them. If I go home without those kids—" Alberg looked at her thoughtfully. "Yes, if you go home without them, what then?" She snapped her mouth shut. "Our Keith'll be broken-hearted," she said. "That's what then." "Where are these kids?" asked Sokolovsky. Naomi darted a glance at her mother-in-law. "Winifred's." "Winifred Gartner?" said Alberg. "I knew she was in on this," said Clara. "Yes," said Naomi defiantly. "What of it?" "Are you planning to go back to Vancouver, Naomi?" said Alberg, "when this business has been settled one way or the other?" She looked surprised. "I haven't thought about it. Maybe not right away. I got me a job here now, unless the asshole's mother here lost it for me, coming in and making trouble like she did." She looked uneasily at Earl, who had taken over behind the counter. "If you get to keep them, who's going to look after the kids while you're at work?" said Alberg. "I haven't figured that out," she said. "Winifred got me a sitter for this afternoon. Beryl, her name is. Maybe she could do it regular." Alberg pulled out his wallet and left some money on the table. Okay, I'm going to call social services. They'll be closed by now, said Naomi, won't they? There's an emergency number, said Sokolovsky. I don't like this, said Clara. She pushed her chair away from the table and stood up. And our Keith's going to like it even less. You mark my words, she said, nodding vigorously at Naomi. You're going to be sorry, missy, very, very sorry. It was wind, thought Winifred the next morning, that made a day seem real. Wind gave a day a personality. It felt like something alive and separate, a day did, when there was wind in it, wind to give it life and power. Today it was colouring the sea a dark, dark blue and ruffling it with white. Winifred felt the wind cuffing her cheek and tossing her hair around and unsettling the sand, sparse among the rocks on the beach. She was sitting on a log and looking out over the bay to the Trail Islands, mulling over the years she had lived in Seashelt and the people she knew there. Winifred was heavy with a grey weight of something sad and ominous, and hadn't yet been able to slip out from under it. She looked at her hands spread upon her knees as if they were a stranger's hands. They were large and rough. She obviously hadn't looked after them for a while. Her cuticles needed pushing back, and the nails needed tending with an emery board. At least they were clean, she thought. At least there was no dirt lodged under them. The skin of her hands was the only skin she could see. She had put on a red blouse in an attempt to lift her spirits, which meant she must have started the day feeling out of whack. She picked up a handful of stones and tossed them one by one toward the sea, but she was sitting too far back and they landed short of the water. Winifred reached into her big black bag for her notebook, and in doing so noticed that the bag was dirty on one side, as if it had been splashed with muddy water. She dug out a couple of tissues and got up to moisten them in the sea. She felt very heavy to herself when she stood up, had to press her hands hard on her knees to lift herself up, and trudged the several steps to the water, feeling as if she'd put on about a ton of weight since the last time she felt happy. She wet the tissues in the sea-water, returned to the log, dropped down upon it, and rubbed at her bag with the wet tissues until the marks were almost gone. It'll do till I get home anyway, she thought. She glanced up and down the empty beach, then stuck the tissues under a rock. She stared out at the water for a while. It was such a very dark blue, almost as dark as the blackberries that were starting to ripen everywhere you turned. Little glints of sun shone off the water like sparks of fire. The sky was blue too, but you'd hardly know there was just the one word for both of those colours, Winifred thought. They were so different from each other today. In the winter sometimes the sea and the sky were both grey, and the one would bleed into the other, so you couldn't hardly tell where the horizon was, and you surely couldn't see the islands on it because they were grey and foggy too. Not today, though, she thought, gazing upon the world. Today those islands were marching across the horizon clear as anything, layers upon layers of them, in different shades of purple and blue. She hauled out her notebook and began another letter to the twins with these observations. She had thought to use this letter, as she'd used so many others, to help her work things out. Winifred often visualized her letters to the twins as a blackboard, and saw herself up there with a piece of chalk, like when she was in school working out a mathematics problem and being praised by the teacher for the precision of her thinking. But her thinking had lately become muddled, which had eroded her confidence, and this was attacking her self-esteem, thereby making her depressed. Winifred read a lot of magazines, and when she could, watched a lot of daytime television. She thought that what was called pop psychology could be very useful, and pop psychology was always urging people to communicate. It apparently wasn't working for her today, though. She couldn't bring herself to talk again to the twins about her problem. She concluded the letter rather abruptly, signed it, and tucked the notebook back in her handbag. Winifred reached down to where she'd leaned her lunch against the log. She hadn't bothered with breakfast this morning, just wanted to get out of the house quick, and now she was too hungry to wait for noon. She unwrapped a tuna salad sandwich and removed the cap from a bottle of summer peach fruit juice and mineral water. As she ate, she watched the traffic on the water, tugboats, a couple of fish boats heading north. She knew that if necessary she'd take matters into her own hands, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. The social services woman who'd come over last night couldn't make head or tail of the situation. so she'd left the kids temporarily with Naomi, because they were very happy with Naomi. Anybody could see that. But more investigating would have to go on before a decision was made. And while that was happening, it looked like Winifred was stuck with all three of them. Winifred shook her head wearily and stuffed the sandwich back into its plastic bag. She'd had only 3 bites and wasn't a bit hungry any more, not even for the peanut butter cookies she'd also brought. She picked up the remains of her lunch, the bottle of juice and her handbag, and plodded back to Grey Greta, parked off the highway across the street from the take-out place. Once inside the cab, she called Miriam. "I'm taking a couple of hours off," she told her, and she hung up quickly before Miriam could tell her how many fares she had waiting. The ferry must have just docked at Langdale because there was a stream of traffic northward. Winifred waited for it to trickle away, then wheeled the cab around and drove up the hill into Seashelt. Winifred had deep reservations about Naomi's mothering skills. She had been hoping against hope that either Naomi would get back together with her husband, or else she'd give up on the kids and return to Vancouver. But now, the little shivers in Winifred's spine that had warned her against Naomi were nothing compared to what she'd felt when she'd met Keith. Winifred pulled up in front of her house, which she knew was empty because Naomi was at work, and Beryl had taken the kids to her house for the day. Naomi had decided they'd better not go to play school in case Clara tried to steal them back. Winifred got out of the cab and took her leftover lunch and her big black bag into the house, where she sat in the middle of the cushioned pine sofa for a long time, thinking some more. She emerged from this reverie feeling no better. Winifred reached into her bag for the notebook and tore off the pages on which she'd written to the twins. She pushed herself up from the sofa and went to the desk in the corner and took an envelope from the drawer. "Roland and Polly Gartner," she printed on the front. She folded the letter and put it inside, licked the flap and sealed it. Then she went into her bedroom. On the top shelf of her closet, way at the back, was a hat box. Winifred took this down and opened it. The box had been made to accommodate a cowboy hat, a tan felt one she'd had once when she was a lot younger. Now it held only a straw hat with flowers stuck in the hatband. Winifred took the hat out, lifted up the cardboard false floor of the box, and placed the letter to the twins in the compartment. She pushed gently at the pile of letters there, moving them around, making room for one more. Then she put the hat box back on the closet shelf. She locked up the house, returned to Grey Greta, and called Miriam to tell her she was back at work. Chapter 19. Her grandmother on her mother's side was English, the sergeant called out to Alberg. "Did I ever tell you that?" It was Thursday evening. "I don't think so, Sid," Alberg called back from the deck of the Sea Nymph. "Is it important?" He dunked the mop in the pail of soapy water and continued scrubbing. "Well, it's back to the hereditary thing." Sokolovsky was wearing casual khaki pants and a yellow polo shirt. Alberg wouldn't let him on board because he had on black-soled running shoes. "The hereditary thing? What hereditary thing?" Alberg stepped up onto the cabin top, mop in hand. "I mean, those English, they tend to be uppity, selfish." "There's nothing uppity or selfish about Elsie, Sid," said Alberg, scrubbing energetically. "Well, I figure that with her it's just coming out in her now, as we get into her declining years." Alberg straightened up and looked at him. Sokolovsky's hands were in his pants pockets, and his shoulders were sagging. Alberg considered him for a moment, then squinted up into the evening sunshine, which felt warm and loving on his face. He cast an exasperated eye upon his sailboat and picked up the pail and mop. "Here." Sokolovsky took them from him. "Finished?" he said, hopefully. "Yeah, finished. I just have to hose her down." While he did this, Sokolovsky emptied the pail into the ocean and turned it upside down on the dock to dry out. "Okay," said Alberg when he turned off the water and coiled up the hose. "Let's head up to the pub." The place was crowded, so they had to sit at the bar, but Alberg kept his eye on the window tables, and as soon as one was vacated he swooped in on it. Alberg hated sitting at a bar. "Order some food," he instructed Sokolovsky, who shook his head. "Then I'll do it for you," said Alberg. "He'll have the clam chowder," he told the waitress, "and I'll have fish and chips. Is it cod or halibut?" "Halibut." "Halibut," he said with satisfaction. "Good. 2 pieces, please, and 2 more beers," he added. "Now," he said to Sokolovsky when the waitress had left, "what is this shit about Elsie's declining years?" Sokolovsky shoved his chair back from the table a little and rubbed his bulky thighs as if they were aching. "It's the only thing I can think of, Karl. Sometimes when they get to a certain age, women, well, they can have a variety of troubles, and Elsie, she's, I guess, taken leave of her senses would be a good way to describe it." Alberg was sitting back with his elbows on the arms of the chair, fingers steepled, gazing at Sokolovsky and trying not to be distracted by the sounds and smells of the harbour coming in the open windows. If he was to turn his head slightly more to the left, he'd just about be able to see his boat. "I told her maybe she should see a shrink," Sokolovsky winced a little, remembering, but she said no. There was a lot of loud talk and laughter coming from a table near the front of the pub, where a crowd of young men and women were drinking beer, eating hamburgers, and watching the TV above the bar. "How did she actually put it to you, Sid, when she told you she wants to move out?" "She said she wants to be on her own for a while." Alberg drank from his glass of beer. Sokolovsky had dumped some salt onto the tabletop. Alberg watched as he licked his index finger, stuck it in the salt, and licked it again. Their table was in a corner far enough away from its neighbours that they couldn't be overheard. Not that anybody was listening anyway. "She must have given you some reason," Alberg said gently. Sokolovsky looked up at him. "She wants to live her life on purpose and not automatically." He shrugged. "She said a bunch of stuff. That's all of it I really remember." The waitress arrived with their orders and another 2 bottles of beer. "You guys are off duty, I guess." "You're right," said Alberg. "Or you wouldn't be drinking beer." "Right again." "Not out in public, anyway." "Not anywhere," said Sokolovsky with a trace of his former righteousness. "You mean you don't have a fridge full of beer over there at the cop shop?" said the waitress, feigning astonishment. Alberg grinned at her. Sokolovsky didn't. "Well, what a disappointment." The waitress moved swiftly to the next table to clear it and wipe it clean before the group waiting at the door could get over there. "Are you sure you don't want to take some time off, Sid?" said Alberg, squeezing a wedge of lemon over his halibut. Sokolovsky looked at him miserably. "I wouldn't know what to do with time off, Karl. I'd just follow her around from home to work and back again, asking her questions she won't answer." Alberg sprinkled malt vinegar on his chips. "It's good that your kids are grown, at least. The Sokolovskys had 5 daughters. You don't have to worry about how this will affect them. I think my kids still haven't forgiven Maura and me." Even as he said this, Alberg realized that it was only him they hadn't forgiven. Because even though it had been Maura who'd ended the marriage, his daughters had thought she'd had good reason. He reminded himself to call Janey. He wanted to put things right between them before he left on Saturday morning. The sergeant picked up a soup spoon and tried some of the clam chowder. "The kids are mostly bewildered, I think. They don't want to say much until they've got more information." He gave a bitter laugh. "It sounds like Elsie needs some time to herself, Sid," said Alberg, chewing on a French fry. "She could quit her damn job at the damn dry cleaners," said Sokolovsky, "and stay home all day. She could have all damn day to herself if she wanted." He pushed his soup bowl away from him and slumped back in his chair. "Jesus, Karl, it hurts, you know, and I'm so damn mad at the same time." "I know, Sid," Alberg said quietly. "Believe me, I do. But there's not a thing you can do about it." "I'm telling you," said Sokolovsky grimly, "I feel pretty belligerent about this. My marriage is the most important thing in my life. I'm not going to hang around and do nothing while it falls apart." "Can I make a suggestion?" "Yeah, of course. That's why I'm here. You're a man with some experience in this area." "Your case is different from mine, though," said Alberg. "Maura left me because my marriage was not the most important thing in my life. The job was." He leaned toward Sokolovsky. "This is my suggestion. Support her in this. Let her go." The sergeant was shaking his head. "Sid, think about it." "I can't." He pushed himself up from the table. "Can't do that. Can't do it, Karl." Alberg watched him lumber slowly through the pub and out the door. Cassandra couldn't look at her. It was Friday afternoon and she was visiting her mother. She kept her eyes fixed on General Hospital. She would pretend not to have heard, but she knew this wouldn't work for long. Her mother would just say it again and again until Cassandra acknowledged her. So finally she turned. "What do you mean?" she said weakly. Helen Mitchell shook her head impatiently. "You know very well what I mean. I spoke English, didn't I?" "I don't think it would be a very good idea," said Cassandra. "I think it's an excellent idea. It would be a nice change for me and for you, too." She uttered an indelicate snort. "Separate holidays! What an astonishing idea! I imagine you're very hurt, Cassandra. You certainly ought to be." "I'm not hurt at all, not in the slightest. It was my idea, for God's sake. I don't like boats. I get seasick on boats." She didn't get seasick at all. She got frightened, but she wasn't going to tell her mother that. "It's extremely selfish of him to go off on a holiday without you. I don't care what you say." "Mother," said Cassandra wearily, "I've told you. He's only going to be gone for a week. We've both got another 2 weeks after that, and that's when we're going to do something together." "Still," said Helen. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I could be very useful to you." "I know, Mum. Sure you could." Her mother had fashioned a sitting area by arranging the 2 armchairs and the coffee table between the bay window and the bed, but the bed continued to dominate the room, as if it were somehow certain that eventually her mother wouldn't need anything else. "Well, then," said Helen. "Look, it's not my house, it's Karl's house. I don't think I should invite anybody else to stay there." "What if you were married?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, would it be all right to invite your mother to stay if you were married?" "I don't know. I guess so." "I don't see the difference." She could be honest and upfront about it, thought Cassandra. She could say, "Mom, you've stayed with me before and I didn't like it. I don't want you to stay with me because we'd fight and I'd be unhappy. I don't want you to stay with me because I don't like being with you all that much. I don't want you to stay with me because you love my brother more than you love me." "Maybe there isn't any difference," said Cassandra quietly, "but that's the way I feel." They turned back to the television set. "I hope you at least plan to stay for tea," said Helen querulously. "Of course," said Cassandra. "Tea on Fridays, dinner out on Sundays." She smiled at her mother, who did not smile back. "There's a fellow out here wants to talk to you," said Isabella that afternoon. "I'm counting the hours now," said Alberg, looking up from his paperwork. "There's less than 2 of them to go. Please, don't tell me it's Reginald. Please." "Nope. This guy's name is Morton." Alberg took off his glasses and tucked them into their case. "Please tell Sokolovsky to join Mr. Morton and me in the interview room," he said, picking up his notebook and a pen. "See," said Frank Morton a few minutes later, "Nathan was poking around, trying to find out who was muscling in on us." "On your delivery business," said Alberg. "Pizza, wasn't it?" "Come on, man," Frank Morton said wearily, plucking at the tufts of hair that sprang sparse and aimless from his freckled scalp. "You want to hear this or not?" "Go ahead," said Alberg, settling into one of the metal folding chairs. Morton sat in another. Sokolovsky, standing, loomed in a corner near the door. Alberg tossed his notebook and pen onto the table. "So Nathan, he's talking to everybody up and down the coast, see? Clients, like. Asking where they're getting their shit, 'cause they sure ain't getting it from us." "And did he find out?" Reflexively, Morton wrapped his arms around himself, hunching his shoulders. "Frank," said Alberg, "what did he tell you?" Morton, his eyes fixed on the battered tin ashtray next to the tape recorder, said, "Okay if I have a smoke?" "Sure," said Alberg, and watched while Morton lit up. "So, what did Kaczynski tell you, Frank?" Morton's owlish eyes, round and dark, with lashes and brows so light as to be almost invisible, looked at him sorrowfully. "Call him Nathan, will you?" "Okay, Nathan. What did he tell you?" "I got to start at the beginning." Morton took another drag and tapped the ash into the ashtray with a surprisingly graceful, somehow sophisticated gesture that made Alberg think of Cary Grant movies. "We been in business together a while now," said Frank. "Nathan looked after the coast. Me, I did Horseshoe Bay up to Whistler." He talked, smoked, talked, smoked. "So everything goes along tickety-poo until all of a sudden, about, I don't know, a couple of months ago. Whatever. Business starts dropping off." The cigarette didn't seem to be soothing his obviously ragged nerves. His heel drummed the floor with an increasingly anxious beat. Well, we knew the clients was still out there, still, you know, still needing the product like, so they was getting it someplace else. Was business dropping off in your neck of the woods as well? Said Sokolovsky, who had moved from one corner to another. Yeah, said Morton, glancing up at him. You're damn right it was. He stubbed out his cigarette and clasped his hands in his lap. And you didn't see this as casual or temporary? You figured it was serious competition moving in on you, said Alberg. Morton nodded vigorously. And we was right, too, wasn't we? Nathan turning up dead's proof of that. Go on, said Alberg. What did Nathan find out? Morton lit another cigarette. His heel was tapping frantically. See, it scared the shit right out of me when he got killed. I'm next, that's what I thought. That's why I took off. But shit, he squinted pathetically at Alberg. What am I going to do in Calgary the rest of my life? I don't know a fucking soul in Calgary. So then I go. Okay, what if I change my mind? Tell the cops what I know. They get this guy, they send him away, and I'm okay. Back in business, said Alberg. Right. Well, no, get me a job, that's what I figure to do. Get me a regular job. He pushed his shoulders back and crossed his legs, his heel for the moment quiescent. Okay, said Alberg. So here you are and here we are. Tell us what you know. Okay. Right. Morton pulled deeply on the cigarette. He put his feet flat on the floor again and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. So Nathan calls me up on whatever day I don't remember, and he says he talked to two guys who told him they'd been making buys from this guy named Keith. He's undercutting us, see? Morton sounded indignant. That's how he's getting our customers. He's charging them less. So Nathan, he called up the guy, this Keith guy, says they need to talk, come to some arrangement or something. So the guy says, sure, fine. And Nathan tells me on the phone they're gonna meet that night, and then he'll call me, say how things went. He looked sadly at Alberg, smoke drifting toward his face from the cigarette, held in his right hand, resting on his knee. But he never called. Keith, said Alberg, looking at Sokolovsky. This Keith, said the sergeant. He got a last name? I don't know what it is, said Morton. Nathan never said. Did he say anything else about the guy, said Alberg. Anything at all? Morton shook his head, took a final puff on his cigarette, and crushed it in the ashtray. That's it. His name's Keith. That's all I know. Where does he live, said Sokolovsky. Seashell? Someplace else on the coast? Morton shrugged. I think someplace on the coast, but I don't know for sure. Had Nathan ever actually seen him, said Alberg. Sort of, said Morton. This client, he pointed him out to him, but Nathan only saw the side of his head like, through the truck window. Alberg and Sokolovsky looked at each other. Was Keith driving this truck, said Alberg. Yeah, an '88 Ford pickup, black. Chapter 20. Cassandra drove Alberg down to the harbor in his Oldsmobile Saturday morning and helped him unload the car and put the stuff, his provisions and personal effects, in the boat. Alberg was still somewhat preoccupied with work, but he knew that would vanish once he was on his way. Sokolovsky had called late last night. Motor Vehicles had confirmed that Keith Hellyer drove an '88 Ford pickup and that he was the only Keith on the Sunshine Coast who did. Sokolovsky and Jack Duggan would pick Hellyer up for questioning this morning. It's a great day for it, said Cassandra, smiling up at Alberg from the dock, shading her eyes from the early morning sun. She wore yellow shorts and a blue and yellow top, and a big leather bag was slung over her shoulder. How come you never used the handbag I gave you, said Alberg, starting the motor. He had been eager to go. Now he was suddenly unwilling, looking for reasons not to leave her. You mean the one that looks like it belongs to Queen Elizabeth, said Cassandra, and she laughed. Come on, it's not my style, Karl, I told you that. She looked at the ropes tying the sea nymph to the dock. Now what do you want me to do here? Alberg was full of uncertainty, looking at her. Just undo those ropes, and when I tell you, throw them on deck. Hey, I didn't kiss you goodbye. Cassandra kissed her fingertips and blew. I'll call you tonight. She undid the ropes. Alberg put the motor in reverse and backed slowly out of his slot. She watched, waving, and moved along the dock so that she could continue to watch as he motored slowly out of the harbor. Then she parked the Oldsmobile in a lot near the marina and walked home, up the hill. Gordon Murphy caught the first ferry to Horseshoe Bay that morning and made a quick trip back to Vancouver to check out the work on the house. He was pleased to find that the job had been completed and was every bit to his satisfaction. He put fresh flowers in the room that would be Cassandra's and left in his BMW, which he had greatly missed. He stopped to get his hair trimmed and styled, and in the afternoon returned to the Sunshine Coast, to the rented house that he'd been occupying for the last 8 days. He packed his bags, checked the place over carefully to make sure he had left nothing behind, tossed the bags into the back seat of the BMW, slid behind the wheel, and drove away. "Good morning, ma'am," said Sid Sokolowski, removing his service cap. "Is this the residence of Keith Harvey Hellyer?" She looked behind him, peering around his shoulder into the patrol car parked on the street. "Did you come with those kids? Did you come to return those kids to their dad?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, no, we didn't. I don't believe that matter's been sorted out yet." "Well, what do you want with our Keith, then?" said Clara Hellyer. "It's a routine matter, ma'am. Is he at home?" "No, he's not at home." "Can you tell us where to find him?" "I don't know where he is. Could be any place. Post office, supermarket, bakery, getting his shoe fixed. Any place." She hesitated. "He's not in any trouble, is he?" "We just want to have a word with him, ma'am," said Jack Duggan. "When do you expect him?" "I expect him for supper, don't I, like always. What's this about, anyway? I demand to know." "It's just routine," said Constable Duggan soothingly. "Thank you for your time, ma'am." Cassandra was slightly depressed when she got home, and started to become more so as she wandered through the house, very much aware of Karl's absence. So she got brisk and stern with herself. After all, the man was only going to be gone for a week, and she'd manage on her own just fine for a whole lot of years before he came along. Thank you very much. She decided to do something physical. She would house-clean the bedroom. She dusted and cleaned the window and polished the wardrobe and vacuumed, and then began reorganizing the closet, a job she'd been putting off for weeks. She got the stool from the kitchen and started with the high, dusty shelf on which were arrayed some of her handbags. She looked at the one that had been a gift from Karl. It was brown and boxy. She took it down, emptied the contents of the shoulder bag onto the bed, transferred them to the brown one, and put the shoulder bag up on the shelf. She noticed a cardboard box up there as well. She hesitated, then took it down and removed the lid. Inside were a half-full bottle of cough medicine, a tube of antacid tablets, a ballpoint pen, and an old pair of jockey shorts. Cassandra looked at this collection of objects for several minutes, her mind working busily. Finally she replaced the lid and put the box back on the shelf. She took the stool back into the kitchen and poured herself some lemonade. What the hell was that stuff? She took a drink into the backyard, having lost her enthusiasm for house-cleaning. It was a pointless task anyway. Bernie had been there just yesterday. Cassandra decided to enjoy what was left of the day, reading, drinking lemonade in the shade, and thinking about Karl gunk-holing around among the Gulf Islands. She went indoors about 5 o'clock, had a bath, and put on a cotton skirt and a short-sleeved blouse. She would ask Phyllis if she'd like to go to a movie, or rent one, and order in Chinese food. The doorbell rang just after 6. Cassandra was in the kitchen, about to pour some milk for the cats. She noticed the time because she'd been looking at the clock on the kitchen wall when the bell sounded, wondering if Phyllis would be home from shopping yet. Cassandra went to the door, glancing casually out the window, looking for a car, but she didn't see one. "Hello, Cassandra," said Gordon Murphy, smiling when she opened the door. "Oh, the look on your face." He tossed his head back and gave a hearty laugh. Cassandra tried to close the door, but his hand shot out and grabbed the edge. "Is your boyfriend at home?" he asked. "Yes," she said quickly. "Good." She stared at him. "Well," he said. "Well, what?" "Where is he? I want to talk to him." "He's not here just yet," she said. "I mean, he's on his way here from work. He's a policeman. Did you know that? Did I tell you that?" Gordon laughed again. "I'm not kidding," said Cassandra. "He is. He's a Mountie." "I know that." Gordon pushed the door open, wrenching it out of her grasp, and stepped into the house. "Oh, boy," he said softly, looking around. He gave a low whistle. "This place certainly is not you." "Gordon, I'd like you to leave." "Can't." "Please." He wagged a finger at her and sat down on the sofa, resplendent in white shorts and T-shirt, white socks and sneakers, white jacket. He knew he looked wonderfully brown and sexy against the bright white of his summer clothing. He smiled his dazzling smile and said to her, "I know he's a policeman. I also know where he is. Out on a sailboat." "You're wrong," said Cassandra. "He was out sailing, but he's on his way home now. He'll be home tonight. This evening, very soon." "Any minute now," said Gordon absently. He looked at her for a long time. He had hoped that logic would convert her here and now, and that if logic failed, sex would triumph. But he had accepted the possibility that she might prove difficult to convince at first. "Oh, well," he said softly to himself. He was prepared for that too, of course. Chapter 21. Winifred, outside in her front yard on Saturday afternoon, watched gloomily, her hands in the pockets of her baggy black sweatpants, as Walter and Tiffany painstakingly planted plastic daffodils in the grass around the front porch. She heard a noise behind her and turned to see Alistair McNeil standing at her gate. They looked at each other in silence. "How's your head?" she said finally. "It's fine." He glanced toward the home of her neighbor, the dope addict. "Thank you for asking." There was another awkward silence. The stems of the plastic flowers were green spears that sank easily into the soil and would have sunk as easily into flesh, so Winifred was keeping a close eye on Naomi's kids. "I let them rummage around in my storeroom," she said, "and they found this box. I don't know where the hell it came from. I don't remember buying this stuff." She gave a little kick to a carton lying nearby. "There's a whole bunch of them in here. Tulips, too." "Are they your grandchildren?" said Alistair. Walter, on his haunches, holding a tulip, struggled to turn around and fell onto his bottom. Winifred gave Alistair a long look. No. They watched for another few minutes. Tiffany jumped up from her squatting position near the house and ran to the box to collect another handful of flowers. Eventually Alistair McNeil said, "Good day to you then, Mrs. Gartner," gave Winifred a little bow, and walked off toward his house. I should have offered him coffee, she thought, or a cup of tea. In Karl Alberg's office, Sid Sokolovsky looked across the desk at his wife. "For how long?" "I don't know, Sid. I told you. I'll be in touch when I find a place." "Sit down, Elsie, will you? I want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." She stood and reached out to place a set of keys on his desk. "Keep them." She shook her head and took a step backward toward the door. "Elsie, I don't want you to go. God damn it, Elsie!" Sokolovsky started to get to his feet just as somebody tapped on the office door. "Sarge," Mike Michelson began. "Get out," Sokolovsky shouted. "Sid," said Elsie, "please." "Out!" "Sorry," said the corporal, retreating. He closed the door. Sid rubbed his face and scalp with both hands. Christ! Elsie stayed where she was, suddenly indecisive. "Do you want me to wait until Karl's back?" He dropped his hands. "No." He took hold of the edge of the desk, struggling to control himself. "You want to go? Go." He breathed in and out and spoke quietly. "Go now." And so she did. Alberg sailed across the Strait of Georgia that day. The wind was strong and the sea was choppy, and the boat required his full attention. It took him several hours to make it across from Gibson's. It was late afternoon when, tired but exhilarated, he approached Gabriola Island. He had intended to go through Gabriola Passage and look for moorage in Pirates' Cove, but the tide looked better in the morning, so he decided to put up at Silver Bay. He started the motor, turned up into the wind, and dropped the foresail. He stowed it, pushed the bag through the hatch into the forward berth, and dropped the main, which he secured to the boom. Then he tied on the fenders and returned to the tiller, put the motor in gear, and puttered toward the entrance to the bay. He was wearing a khaki denim hat with a brim, and he'd slathered his face with sunscreen several times during the day. But not often enough, apparently. His skin felt stretched and sore, and it radiated heat. Alberg turned the sea nymph into Silver Bay, and saw a bright scattering of boats, some drifting lazily at anchor in the middle of the bay, others moored to wharves. He idled across the water and squeezed in between a Cal 27 and a San Juan 24. He tied up and turned off the motor, began straightening up below. He was pleasurably aware of the sounds of seagulls, the breeze in the rigging, far-off laughter, and the water plucking curiously at hulls and piers and beaches. Tomorrow he'd catch the high tide at the passage early in the morning, meander the day away, maybe poke around in Pirates' Cove, and figure on spending the night at Ganges on Salt Spring Island. Alberg turned on his radio telephone and set the channel, then lit the charcoal in the hibachi secured to the rail. He took a beer from the icebox and, ignoring his sunburned face, settled himself on cushions in the cockpit and gazed out over the bay. The sun had drifted almost to the horizon. He could see it glinting behind the trees on the western side of the bay. The water was very still. A red dinghy was being lowered from an enormous powerboat anchored 20-odd feet away. A middle-aged couple climbed down the ladder, got in, and rowed toward shore. Alberg sighed, drank some beer. He closed his eyes. When the charcoal was ready, he opened the icebox and pulled out a hamburger patty, a tomato, and a cucumber. He put the burger onto grill and got a bun from a bag in his food cupboard. He drank a second beer with his food and checked the time. He'd told Cassandra and Sid Sokolovsky that he would monitor the radio between 7 and 8 every evening. It was after 8 now. He wasn't surprised not to have heard from Sid, but he had expected that Cassandra would call. He waited a few more minutes, then picked up the mic. When the marine operator came on the line, Alberg gave her his call sign, his BC Tel identification number, and his home phone number in Gibson's. "I'm sorry, no answer," said the operator after a minute. She was probably out for dinner with somebody, Phyllis maybe, or Paula from the library. He wouldn't turn off his radio yet, though. Alberg washed and dried his dishes, wiped the sink and the tiny counter, and stowed everything away. He returned to the cockpit. The light was fading rapidly. Lights burned in most of the boats now, and the air was much cooler. He stowed the cushions in a locker so they wouldn't be dew-soaked in the morning, and went below to make up his berth. He was uneasy, though he knew this was irrational. She had said she would call, though, and this wasn't something she'd forget to do, not Cassandra. But maybe he'd misunderstood her. Maybe she'd said she would call, not meaning tonight, but tomorrow or the next night. Alberg put in the hatch door, but left the cover open. Then he stripped to his shorts, found his glasses and his paperback, got another beer and climbed into bed. No, he was sure she'd said she would call him tonight. He reached up for the radio and tried again. Still no answer. Shit, this was ridiculous. If anything had happened to her, somebody would have let him know. He'd try again first thing in the morning, and if she still didn't answer, he'd call Sid, have him take a look around. He turned off the radio, settled in against the pillow, and tried to get absorbed in the book, and eventually he did. Gordon Murphy, in his basement exercise room on Sunday morning, wearing sweatpants and a sweatshirt, skipped energetically with a leather rope. He had become adroit with his skip rope. He had learned to cross it in front of him and behind him, too, without missing a beat. He started his workout slowly, gradually built up speed, and then continued at a steady pace, enjoying the sound of the rope knifing through the air. Soon he had to stop for a minute to strip off his sweats, under which he wore gym shorts and a muscle shirt. Then he resumed skipping. Every so often he turned the rope as fast as he could. The noise became dense and furious, like a crowd of angry birds beating the air to death. Then he slackened off again, steadying his pace. He skipped for a minimum of 20 minutes, and on this day he did 30. He was dripping with sweat when he finished. He dropped the rope and wiped himself down, admiring himself in one of the full-length mirrors installed around the room. Next he did 2 circuits of the 12-weight machines, which, along with an exercise bicycle, a treadmill, a rowing machine, and a warm-up mat, made up his own private gym. He found it extremely satisfying to have achieved a pinnacle of fitness and then to keep himself there. After his workout, Gordon Murphy sprinted up the 2 flights of stairs to what he called his suite, which consisted of bedroom, bathroom, and dressing room. He showered, shaved, and dressed, thinking about the day. He didn't have much of a plan, wanted to do the garden thing, but that was about all. He knew he had to take it slowly. It was important not to rush. Have patience and tolerance, he reminded himself. Show her your firmness, but also your affection. Let her see the future in glimpses, only in glimpses, and eventually she will be tantalized, fascinated, enthusiastic, enraptured. It might be a long, slow road, but they'd get there in the end. It was a sunny day, he observed with satisfaction. His garden always looked better in sunshine. He chose his clothes carefully, intent upon looking casual but rich. Gordon Murphy had 2 walk-in closets. His dressing room also had shelves for sweaters, shelves for shoes, shelves for hats, and drawers for underwear, scarves, gloves, handkerchiefs, socks and dress shirts, laundered and packaged. He wondered if she would shiver to see him in shorts that revealed his genitals, in a muscle shirt cut low front and back and under the arms. Maybe he'd take her down into his gym one day, he thought, shuffling through his closet. He put on a pair of jeans and a blue cotton shirt and sneakers with no socks, and as he tied his shoes he imagined her kissing his ankle, her lips pressed into the hollow below the bone, her lips stroking the skin there. He warned himself again not to rush things. The plan, as outlined in detail, was a good plan, and he must not rush it. He slapped aftershave on his cheeks and washed his hands, whistling to himself, studying his image in the mirror. Then he winked, dried his hands, and skipped downstairs to the kitchen. Gordon Murphy had a kitchen that was almost completely white. It had a butcher block island and so many small appliances that there were some he had never used. They were arrayed on the countertops, suspended under cabinets, stashed away in cupboards, affixed to the walls. He got the coffee started, then made himself a banana breakfast drink in the blender, and gulped this down with a selection of vitamin pills. Next he pulled out a frying pan and got bacon and eggs from the fridge and 2 pieces of brown bread from a sliced loaf in the freezer. He turned on the fan over the stove because he couldn't bear the smell of bacon. He breathed through his mouth as he cooked it for her. He kept the bacon warm in the toaster oven while he cleaned out the pan, added butter, and cracked 2 eggs into it. One of them broke, so he decided to scramble them. He chopped fine a couple of green onions and dropped them into the egg mixture, moving it around with a fork until it set. Then he buttered the toast, arranged everything on a platter, and added a glass of orange juice and a mug of coffee. He couldn't remember if she took anything in her coffee, cream or sugar or both, and for a moment he experienced a flicker of uncertainty. He looked down at the platter and out the window at the blue and gold August day, thought about his gym and how he looked in the mirrors there, tasted nausea at the back of his throat. But it's just the damn bacon, he told himself, just the fucking bacon. He took the vial of ground-up halcyon from the vitamin cupboard, shook some of it into the orange juice, stirred it vigorously, and proceeded upstairs, bearing the tray. Chapter 22. There was police here, Clara said indignantly on Sunday morning, fixing her gaze on Keith, who had just arrived home. It wasn't the first time he'd been out all night. He whirled around. She saw the fear in his eyes and put a hand over her mouth. "Keith! Oh, no, your dad'll be beside himself. You said you weren't doing that no more." He hurried into the living room and looked outside. "Come here," he said to his mother. When she got there, he said, "Watch out this window. If those fucking cops show up again, yell." He moved toward the stairs. "Oh, Keith, what are you doing?" "I'm getting out of here," he said, taking the steps 2 at a time. Then he yelled down at her, "Find that woman's address in the phone book. Where Naomi's at." Clara hurried off to do it. Then she stood by the window, pulling at her fingers until they cracked, making whimpering noises. There were tears in her eyes when he came banging downstairs carrying 2 suitcases and a gym bag. "What's the address?" he said, and she gave it to him. "That bitch, she's not getting to keep those kids." Clara was out and out crying as he tossed the bags into the back of his truck. He gave her a swift hug. "I'll be in touch," he said, and he drove off. The pain in her heart, Clara noticed, was tempered a little by relief. In Cassandra's dream there was a very big, long-handled axe whose name, Thunder, was carved into the head. She was shown how to light it by banging the head against concrete, which created sparks. Cassandra, in her dream, was told that she might use this axe twice, and the unseen someone or something that was the benevolent custodian of the axe watched, encouraging her as she picked it up. She wielded it confidently, banged it joyously against concrete. There was a whooshing sound, and sparks flew, ordered fragments of fire. As she swung it high aloft, the axe threatened several things or people, evil and dangerous things or people, and they slunk away. But when she took her second turn, Cassandra got only fizzles of sparks, no matter how hard she banged and banged the axe against concrete. She became disgusted then, and threw it aside. Next she was in a wooden room at the top of a flight of rickety wooden steps, and her brother was there too. The door was closed. They were hiding. And then they heard terribly loud footfalls on the stairs, and Cassandra knew who was coming, and she was terrified, and so was her brother. The door flew open, admitting a burst of golden sunlight with motes in it that made Cassandra think of sawdust, and the axe was standing there, huge and towering, brandishing itself. It had metamorphosed into a human-like creature that could wield itself. It stood still in the doorway, holding itself aloft, and looked first at Cassandra and then at her brother, and she knew that it would attack her brother first, and as it moved toward him she was flooded with relief, and ducked around it, and ran out the door and down the steps and into the darkness outside. And she heard the thwacks, and heard her brother screaming, and "I did not help him, did not help him." Cassandra woke with her heart pounding, sweaty, filled with terror and shame. She sat up quickly, panting, staring at the wall, fighting the dream. There were tears in her eyes. She would have liked to go back into the dream to relive the end of it and save her brother, but she was too frightened, too relieved to be awake, to be safe. But gradually the dream retreated, and the real world made a stronger and stronger claim upon her consciousness, and Cassandra remembered that she was not safe after all. She was in a small, bright room in the top of a house. 3 walls had no windows. The 4th wall was the down-sloping roof in which 3 long windows had been installed. Through these windows Cassandra could see the tops of some Lombardy poplars and the sky, and a seagull treading scratchily across the roof. She imagined the bird looking in and wondering about her. Cassandra sat on the daybed, blinking at the sunlight. She was profoundly reluctant to get up and cross the room to the door. Of course it wasn't locked, she told herself. Of course I'm free to leave. Her mouth, she realized, was very dry. She reached for the glass on the bedside table. She put the glass to her lips, tipped it up, and extended her tongue, keeping her lips wrapped tight around it, letting a drop of the liquid in the glass touch the very tip of her tongue. She identified the liquid as water and let herself drink. Cassandra put the glass back and swung her feet over the side of the bed. This took a great deal of energy. She was astonished and confused to find herself so weak. She stood slowly and almost immediately sank back down on the bed. Her legs weren't strong enough to carry her anywhere, and she wondered how the hell she was going to get down 2 flights of stairs. How had she known there were 2 flights of stairs? Through a half-open door she glimpsed a bathroom. She got to her feet again, leaning heavily upon the night table, took a step, reaching out for the arm of a stuffed chair, and made her way slowly, uncertainly, toward the bathroom. Her legs felt like spaghetti. That's exactly how they felt. She wouldn't have believed it, but it was true. She thought about Scarlett O'Hara. If she could put off considering her situation for even a few minutes, she could perhaps stave off panic. Don't try to think, she told herself. Don't poke around in your head for information. One thing at a time. Get into that bathroom. And she did so, with the help of various pieces of furniture. It's really rather cluttered, she thought, this little room. She got into the bathroom, closed the door behind her, and almost toppled to the floor in there, but didn't. She used the toilet and sat there for a long time afterwards. Maybe I'm falling asleep again, she thought. No, I'm just gathering my strength. She stared between her knees at the floor, which was made of black and white tiles. After a while they began to grow and then to shrink, and their edges started to move around, and they seemed to clatter against each other down there, like a handful of dominoes thrown to the floor. She blinked several times, stood up unsteadily, pulled up her underpants, and flushed the toilet. Cassandra turned to the sink. She washed her hands and face thoroughly and dried them on a black hand towel. There was no mirror in the bathroom. Where the mirror ought to have been, right over the sink, there was a watercolor of a vase full of flowers, huge sunflowers in shades of yellow, orange, and gold, with a few lilacs mixed in among them. This bothered Cassandra enormously. It hurt her brain to see sunflowers and lilacs together. It wasn't right, but she couldn't remember why. She was clutching the sink with both hands, resting most of her weight on it. She let go with her left hand for a second to open the bathroom door and looked through into the bedroom and saw some clothing she recognized, folded neatly in a pile on what seemed to be a small desk. She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing a thigh-length nightgown with short sleeves, green and white striped. This garment she did not recognize. Cassandra turned on the tap and scooped handfuls of cold water into her mouth and over her face and on her neck. She pulled the nightgown off and splashed more water onto her breasts and all over her body until she was shivering. Then she turned off the tap and patted herself dry with the small black towel. She was more awake now, and a turmoil of information clamored for permission to dump itself out of her unconscious brain, to spread-eagle itself for her edification. She cautioned it, though. "Hold off, hold back. Let me get my own clothes on first." This was necessary because of vulnerability and a need for courage. She made her way, more surely this time, across the room to the desk, and in bright, gilded, knife-edged sunlight put on a bra, a cotton skirt, a short-sleeved yellow blouse, and sandals, clothing that was oh so familiar. Her breath stumbled in her throat and her eyes filled with tears as she touched these things. She handled them with tenderness, as if they were live things to which she owed love and protection. Cassandra dressed herself, lovingly girding herself. With her face in the sunlight, her eyes closed against its brilliance, she ran her fingers through her hair. She turned at the sound of a tap on the door, opened her eyes, saw the door open and a smiling face peek around it. Gordon Murphy stepped in, holding a breakfast tray. "Good morning," he said, smiling. The scent of his cologne was stronger than the smell of bacon, eggs, toast, and coffee. A convulsive shudder occurred in Cassandra's stomach and moved up into her throat. She saw that there was a bud vase on the tray and that it held a red rose. She was certain that if he was to take a single step closer to her, holding that damn bacon and eggs, carrying that damn rose, wearing that nauseating cologne, she would throw up. "I'll do it onto the tray," she thought, or better yet, onto the front of his blindingly white T-shirt. "I want to go home," she said, immediately. He didn't speak for a moment or move, just stood still and looked at her. She couldn't read his face. "You are home," he said finally. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" said Gordon later, beaming appreciatively upon the afternoon. "I do a certain amount of the work myself, yes," he said as if she had asked him a question, "but not most of it. Somebody else does most of it. Now here, you see," he said, gesturing across the sweep of lawn toward the stone fence that divided the property from the neighbors to the west. "When I moved into this house, this was a mass of blackberry bushes. The whole place had been allowed to go wild, to rack and ruin." He turned full circle, scanning, momentarily puzzled. He had said that so easily. A mass of blackberry bushes, rack and ruin. He clamped his teeth together. He didn't remember any blackberry bushes. He didn't remember any rack and ruin. They moved off the patio onto a wide concrete path. "This goes around the whole house," he told her. "I'm taking you on a tour." "Now, obviously," he said, maneuvering past a grouping of low-growing azaleas, "we can't go to the far reaches out here. Not today. Some day we will." He squeezed her shoulder. "I'm trying very hard to keep my happiness in check." He threw back his head and laughed, letting the sound chuckle out of him, deep and warm. He knew it was an extremely pleasant sound because of the breadth of his chest and the voluptuous timbre of his voice. He knew his voice was one of his more engaging attributes. "And I will, too," he continued. "I won't rush you. We'll take our time." But he couldn't resist laying a kiss upon her hair, just above her temple, and he let himself growl softly into her ear, too, a seductive allusion to what was to come. "Oh, baby," he said softly, straightening. He liked the sound of that. It had a cheerful, reckless quality that he thought appropriate. "Baby, we are going to have such a life." He moved briskly along the walk and around the corner of the house. Here he stopped and gestured again toward a bank of rhododendrons 10 feet high and extending the width of the property, effectively screening the house from the street. "These are gorgeous," he said, "in the spring. You'll love them. And in the middle there," he said, pointing to a circular garden about 8 feet in diameter, "where the driveway curves around, there are tulips in the spring, bright red ones with a border of grape hyacinths. And when those are done, the annuals go in." He proceeded across the front of the house and along the other side, past plantings of chrysanthemums, and came to a halt again at the northwest corner. "There's the rose garden," he said sentimentally. 24 plants, mostly hybrid teas. The flower I brought you this morning, it's a Mr. Lincoln. I'm very partial to roses." He bent to press his cheek against hers. "I knew you would be, too." He stood straight again and moved around the corner and back onto the patio. "It's such a beautiful afternoon," he said happily. "I think we should sit out here for a while, maybe have some iced tea. Would you like that? Or some lemonade? Would you prefer lemonade?" He squatted in front of the wheelchair, smiling at her. "Your wish is my command. Just nod your head. Tea? No? Lemonade? No?" His smile was fading. He was beginning to feel impatient with her. He stood up, and with his hands in his pockets looked around at the tubs overflowing with marguerites and petunias and heliotrope, at the baskets dripping with fuchsias and lobelias and ivy geraniums. Tables and chairs were scattered across the length and width of the patio, as if he'd been expecting a deluge of visitors. And in fact one of his fancies was to host a neighborhood barbecue with this woman, Cassandra, at his side, smiling, flushed with happiness. He looked down at her, sullenness making his bones heavy and his flesh sag. He felt like leaving her out here, all day and all night until she peed her pants and starved to death. Nobody could see her unless they climbed over the stone wall, and there wasn't much chance of that. Shaughnessy was a place where, if you didn't already know your neighbors when you moved in, there was little chance you ever would. People ignored their neighbors in Shaughnessy, unless one of those neighbors ripped down the house he'd bought and put up a great pink fucking monster, and there wasn't any chance that Gordon Murphy would do that. All Gordon Murphy wanted was to be ignored by his neighbors and to have the love of a good, sexy, decent woman. "Is that too much to ask, for fuck's sake?" he shouted at her. And then he made a big, helpless gesture with his arms, because he was a loving, expansive, caring person. "And I'm fucking rich, too," he said, grabbing the wheelchair handles, propelling her roughly toward the house. He noticed that her hands were gripping the arms tightly, as if she was afraid the thing might topple over, as if the scarves binding her wrists snugly to the chair arms and the belt that embraced her firmly from left shoulder to right hip weren't enough to keep her in place. He hauled open the patio door and pushed the chair up the shallow ramp and into the living room. He sat down on a hassock and stared at her eyes, which were a little glassy, but intelligent and aware. He reached toward her. She flinched and closed her eyes tightly. This depressed and disgusted him, but he ignored it. He pulled off the scarf that he'd tied around her mouth. "So," he said coldly, "what's it going to be? Are you going to be my love, or what?" Chapter 23. Winifred went to church that Sunday for some unknown reason. People were surprised to see her there, the minister included, but they weren't any more surprised than Winifred herself. When she got home, Naomi's kids greeted her as if she'd known them a lot longer than she had. Kids were like that, of course. They either liked you right away or maybe they never would, but she wished they were less exuberant with their affection. Poor little tykes, she thought, paying Beryl, who was babysitting while Naomi looked at a couple of apartments to rent, pulled this way and that, don't know where they'll be from one day to the next. She got them settled in front of the TV and found a program for them, one about animals, how to take care of house pets. Then she went into her bedroom to change. She put on a cool, short-sleeved robe that was made of cotton and hung long and loose to her feet. It was blue with large orange parrots all over it. Winifred had bought it at a garage sale down in Gibson's last summer. On her way past the guest room, she glanced in. The bed wasn't made, and the sleeping bags the kids were using hadn't been rolled up and stowed away in the closet like Winifred had asked Naomi to do. Winifred stood very still. She let a hot surge of rage make its way untrammeled through her chest, thinking perhaps that it would spend itself, but it didn't. Her toleration of it only made her anger grow. She quickly made the bed, quickly rolled up the sleeping bags. She scooped toys from the floor and dropped them into the carton she'd placed against the wall next to the dresser, and picked up Naomi's brush and opened the top dresser drawer and let it fall in there on top of a box of condoms. Winifred had the drawer almost closed when that registered. She yanked it open again and stared inside. Yes, condoms. "Winifred," called Tiffany. "Winifred!" Winifred ran up the hall and into the living room. Tiffany, on her knees on the sofa, was pointing out the window. "Daddy's here." She looked at Winifred, her face solemn. Winifred thought Tiffany's face looked like a flower. A pansy, she thought, blooming sweetly from the soft tangle of her hair. Keith got out of his truck and ran up the walk to Winifred's front step and started banging on the door. The woman on the television was explaining how to brush your dog's teeth. Winifred couldn't imagine doing such a thing. "I've come for my kids," Keith hollered. "Open up!" Winifred walked to the fireplace and took down one of the crossed swords from the wall above the mantel. They'd been her father's from when he was in the army, dress swords worn in a scabbard on his belt. She didn't know how he'd come to have two of them. She'd only ever seen him wearing one at a time. "Open up!" He banged again on the door. "I'm in a fucking hurry here." Winifred raised the sword to waist height and opened the door. "No." "What the fuck is this?" Keith attempted to shove past Winifred, but she thrust the sword into him. He let out a cry of pain and disbelief and fell onto her porch. "You don't deserve to have children," said Winifred. She pushed his foot off the threshold, closed the door, and locked it. "If I have a hero," said Gordon Murphy, "it's Jean Genet. Do you know who he is?" He waited politely. "Of course you do. He talks about the importance of dreaming in the life of a hoodlum. I guess he means in the life of a man in prison. I think of myself as a hoodlum, even though I'm not in prison." He assumed a position of openness and invitation, his arms spread along the back of the sofa, his knees casually apart, his smile gentle and warm. Genet's hoodlum has dignity and fierceness and a terrifying, thrilling beauty. He leaned forward now, resting his forearms on his knees. "Your dead man is inside you," he quoted, "mingled with your blood. He flows in your veins, oozes out through your pores, and your heart lives on him, as cemetery flowers sprout from corpses. He emerges from you through your eyes, your ears, your mouth. Isn't that great stuff? Isn't that fucking great?" Now he sprawled on the sofa, suddenly impatient, restless. "I'm wanting sex pretty badly," he said, his eyes roving around the room. "This whole house, it's been redone just for you. Did you know that? Have I already told you that? The little room upstairs, that's just temporary. You're only going to be there for a few days, until we can dispose of all this shit," he said, waving at the wheelchair, the bindings, the gag. "You have no idea how incredibly frustrating it is not to have sex or conversation or companionship with you. The sooner this part of the thing is over with, the better." He knelt in front of her and put his hands on her waist, on her breasts. "I could make you come." He opened her blouse and slid it from her shoulders and did the same with the straps of her brassiere. He pulled down the bra, sitting right here. He placed his mouth on her nipple and swiped his tongue across it, and again. He lifted his head and looked into her eyes. "I don't rape people," he said sternly, "whatever you might think. I don't intend to have sex with you until you're ready." He licked her other nipple. "But I could make you come now," he said, "with my tongue and my fingers." He moved his mouth back and forth from one nipple to the other, licking, sucking, kneading her breasts with his hands, and he began to moan, and his moans became louder and came faster, and finally he shuddered and collapsed in her lap. "Shit! Fuck! I came in my goddamn shorts." He got to his feet and strode out of the room. He took the stairs 2 at a time and ran into his dressing room, where he pulled off his shorts and tossed them into the laundry hamper, then went into his bathroom to clean himself up. He put a little talcum powder down there and took a minute to look at his penis, wondering if it was bigger than Jean Genet's. Then he put on clean shorts and went back downstairs, where he adjusted Cassandra's clothing, flicked off the wheelchair's brakes, and pushed her into the kitchen. "Lunchtime," he said thoughtfully, bending over to look into the fridge. "What shall we have for lunch?" "A rhetorical question," he said, grinning at her over his shoulder. But then he looked at her more intently and stood up straight, letting the fridge door close. "What's the worst thing that could happen," I asked myself, "if I were to take off that gag now, right this minute? She could yell and scream at the top of her lungs, I answer myself. If she did that, I'd put the sucker right back in her mouth and tie it good and tight, much tighter than it's in there now. Nobody could hear you anyway, Cassie. But I would find all that noise extremely irritating." He leaned closer to her. "Your eyes are getting so big, and your head is bobbing up and down like a woodpecker's." He threw out his arms. "What the hell," he said expansively. "You're all drugged up anyhow. Probably we only need that in there when we go out into the garden." He untied the scarf. Cassandra gasped. "Thank you," she croaked. "You're welcome," said Gordon Murphy, grinning. "Can I please have a glass of water?" "May I have a glass of water?" he said, wagging his finger at her. "May I? May I please have some water?" "Of course, my dear, I aim to please." He filled a glass with bottled water from the fridge, got a straw, and held the glass while she drank. "Eyes blackened by fists are the pimp's shame," he quoted. "But Darling says, 'My 2 bouquets of violets.'" When she was finished, he leaned down to kiss her temple tenderly. "Don't pull away, my darling," he said softly. "Pulling away is a very bad thing." He went back to the fridge, humming to himself, and inspected its contents for several minutes. "A salad, I think." He got out a head of butter lettuce, 3 plum tomatoes, a small zucchini, 2 hard-boiled eggs, and a bottle of commercial salad dressing. From a cupboard he took a can of salmon. In the freezer compartment of the fridge he found 2 sourdough rolls, which he removed from their plastic freezer bags and placed on a piece of paper toweling to thaw. He poured himself a glass of white wine and set to work putting the salad together. "What did you mean about redoing the house?" Cassandra said hoarsely. "You wouldn't have liked it the way it was, so I had it changed." He plunged the cutting blade of the automatic can opener into the tin of salmon and waited for it to revolve. "It's a very nice house." "I know. I knew this was the way you'd like it." He dumped the salmon into a small bowl. "Bringing me here?" "Yes," he said, breaking up chunks of salmon with a fork. Cassandra managed a smile. "Audacious. It was audacious." He put down the fork, staring at her. He placed his hands palm down on the butcher block. "Audacious." He shook his head in wonderment. "Audacious." He hurried to the wheelchair and crouched in front of it, covering Cassandra's bound hands with his own. She saw tears sparkling in his eyes. "You are perfect," he whispered. "I knew it. You're the perfect one for me." She let him slide the side of his face against her cheek. She let his lips touch the edge of her mouth. She felt his warm breath and smelled his aftershave. She made her body relax, and foggily, unsteadily, she began to pray for wisdom. Chapter 24. On Sunday evening, Ronnie parked the grey Toyota outside the pub in Gibson's, the one that looked out over the water. It wasn't late, but the town was quiet except for the pub. The harbour was packed, boats were roped in 3 abreast, and on some lights burned, and from some laughter drifted on the night air toward the shore. The breeze stroked music from sailboats at rest, the sound of rigging against masts. Ronnie walked up the hill, and the noises from the pub and the harbour and the soft slapping of the sea against the pilings retreated. And now he heard the muted crunch of his sneakers in the gravel at the edge of the road, and in the distance a car squealed around a corner. It wasn't quite night time yet. He turned to look down the hill at the town, and the sky was still light behind the land that stretched out and around to form the other side of the harbour. When he turned back, though, he couldn't see for an instant or two because it was so much darker where he was going than back where he had been. The sounds of backyard conversations floated through the hot summer evening, and the smells of barbecued dinners. Most of the houses Ronnie passed were dark. Sometimes he saw people moving behind their windows, purplish shadows in the dusk. And that was him, of course, moving through their houses, through their lives, with them never knowing he'd been there. Ronnie smiled to himself in the growing darkness, feeling a kinship with all people, related to them through curiosity, and a tender, secret regard. He came to a corner created by a side street and turned at a new cedar fence, walked to the end of it, where it met a garage, and stepped around behind the garage into darkness. Here he waited for several minutes. A car drove along the side street, stopped at the corner, and headed into town. Ronnie heard the jangling of a license tag against a dog collar and the thudding of footsteps, and peeked out to see a jogger plodding through the light that spilled from the street lamp on the corner. A German shepherd trotted next to him. The dog glanced over toward Ronnie, and then they were gone, out of the light behind the trees. Ronnie slipped out from behind the garage and along the fence to the gate, which he passed through. He was in a large backyard, and although he couldn't see much, he smelled roses. The darkened house next door, Ronnie knew, was for sale and unoccupied. He made his way up the steps and turned on his flashlight to study the lock. But the door, which led, he saw, to a sun porch, wasn't locked. Ronnie was amazed. A surprising number of people did this, left their houses unlocked except when they went to bed at night, and sometimes even then. But Ronnie hadn't expected this to be the case at the home of the head of an RCMP detachment. He knew that Alberg himself was away, but he certainly had thought that anybody a Mountie lived with would also make sure their house was locked. Ronnie shook his head. He put on his gloves, opened the door, and went inside. His list of interesting people had a subsection, which was people who were important in the community. He was starting with the police chief. That wasn't what he was called, but it was what he was, because even Ronnie, much as he loved risks and rushes, wasn't arrogant enough to tinker his way into this particular household while the guy was in town. Also, in his subsection were the mayor and the newspaper editor and maybe the high school principal. He hoped to get to all of them before leaving Seashelt. Ronnie had decided not to enter Alberg's house while the librarian was in bed asleep. There was something unseemly about that, so he'd opted to come while she was having her usual Sunday dinner with her mother, who lived at Shady Acres. Ronnie figured he had at least an hour. He crossed the sun porch, glancing curiously at the enormous wardrobe that loomed there, and slid through the door into the kitchen. 2 cats had appeared and were meowing, but Ronnie paid them no mind. He stood stock still in the kitchen and knew that something was terribly wrong. Ronnie, unmoving, let his eyes move. They caught on a strangeness, studied this, identified it. A knocked-over milk carton on the kitchen counter. He shone his flashlight there and saw that milk had spilled from the counter onto the floor, splashing the cupboard door as it fell. Next to the milk carton were dishes for the cat food. The cats had lapped up some of the milk, maybe most of it, but Ronnie was breathing through his mouth because there was still some lying there where it had spilled, smelling warm and sour and nauseating. But what was a pushed-over milk carton, he asked himself? What were 2 cats plaintively yowling as if in hunger? He stretched his hand behind him, fumbling for the doorknob. But no, he didn't understand this fear he had. He wouldn't let it chase him from the house. "Hang in there, guys," he said out loud to the cats. It made him feel better to hear the sound of his own voice. "She'll be home in an hour." When he left the kitchen, they meowed less loudly, and then they stopped altogether and sat down to clean themselves. Ronnie moved in the faint light from the street lamp into the main room of the house, which was a combination dining room and living room. He cast the beam of his flashlight carefully around, turning in a small, slow circle. He saw an ottoman overturned. On a table next to a wing chair, a glass, almost full of a pale yellow liquid. It must have once held ice, for it had sweated, and sat now in a pool of water that had discolored the tabletop. And on the floor, next to the chair, snuggled up against it, a woman's handbag. Ronnie looked at this for several seconds. He went into the bedroom, which was neat and tidy, although crowded, and smelled of furniture polish, and then into the bathroom, which was very clean, except for the cat's box under the sink. Then he went to the front door. It, too, was unlocked. Ronnie sat on the edge of the wing chair and tried to think. He had no real reason to believe that anything was wrong, no logical reason. So the milk had been spilled, so the ottoman had been knocked over, so the cats hadn't been fed, so she'd left her purse behind. These things were probably insignificant. She'd gotten upset, maybe had a distressing phone call, and had rushed out of the house, forgetting her handbag, maybe tripped on the ottoman on her way out. Ronnie nodded to himself. This made sense. But there was still this feeling he had of dreadful strangeness. He thought a bit longer. Then he went outside into the backyard. He waited in the corner by the gate, the fragrance of roses keeping him company for a long time. He waited until it was midnight. Then he went back inside and fed the cats. He thought about locking the doors front and back before he left, but decided to leave everything the way he'd found it. Ronnie went down the hill, unlocked the Toyota, and drove home, troubled and uneasy. Chapter 25. On Sunday, Alberg sailed from Silver Bay to Ganges on Salt Spring Island. He tried again that evening to reach Cassandra. He called Sid Sokolovsky, too, but couldn't reach him either. He ate and read and found himself becoming irritated with Cassandra. He was worrying about her instead of enjoying his boat, and this wouldn't have happened if she'd called him like she said she would. Early Monday morning he turned on the radio and was putting the coffee on when he heard the Vancouver Coast Guard radio giving out the traffic list. Among the boats listed was his. He called them immediately and was intensely disappointed to learn that the message was not from Cassandra, but from Isabella. Alberg didn't want to talk to Isabella. He wiped off the seats in the cockpit and got the cushions out of a locker. He made himself a cheese sandwich, and when the coffee was ready, took his breakfast up into the cockpit and ate sitting in the morning sun. On the other hand, he thought, he could ask Isabella to have somebody go to his house and find out what the hell was going on. He wasn't seriously worried, but he was somewhat worried. So he called the Vancouver marine operator and got put through to Isabella. "We've got trouble over here, Karl," she said. "You're going to have to come home." "What's going on?" "It's Sid Sokolovsky." He felt a wave of relief, which he told himself was to be expected. He didn't live with Sid Sokolovsky. He wasn't in love with Sid Sokolovsky. "He's gone round the bend," said Isabella. "Just sits there at your desk, staring down at it. Whenever anybody tries to talk to him, he just says to leave him alone. So I told him to go home." "Jesus Christ," said Alberg. "Do you know how to reach Elsie?" "No." "Nobody's in charge here, Karl." "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Who's on duty? Let me talk to him." "Well, the thing is," he heard her take a breath, "everybody's down at Winifred's. She's locked herself in her house with those kids belonging to the waitress at Earl's." Alberg was looking out through the hatch at the shore, watching a black jeep winding down the hill toward the village. "I'm not believing you, Isabella. This is a cruel practical joke you're playing on me. No, listen, she's in there with the kids and a great big Jeesley sword." "A sword?" "She stabbed somebody with it. He's not hurt bad, but still—" Alberg looked unhappily around the shadowy cabin of his sailboat. "I'm awfully sorry, Karl." "I'll call Tyre," he said. "I'll be there in an hour or so." Cassandra, in her dream, was standing with a group of people, both male and female, but mostly female. Everyone was shaken and horrified, their eyes focused on a woman in the middle of the group who was quiet and docile, dressed in grey and white. Her head was bent. She was sitting on something, a stool, and all these people, including Cassandra, were surrounding her. She was a woman who periodically went berserk and stabbed people to death, and she was just now recovering from one of these attacks. She was extremely strong at these times, and nobody could stop her. Cassandra, gazing upon her, realized that the mad woman must be killed immediately, while she was still in a state of dormancy. She was horrified by the idea, but knew that it had to be done, for the good of the community. She spoke this aloud. The others accepted it. They helped Cassandra take the mad woman by the arms, lead her into an apartment, and lay her down in a bathtub. She lay there quietly, unaware of people or place. Cassandra had a large knife in her hand now. She knelt next to the tub, raised the knife, and plunged it into the woman's chest. She wakened abruptly, gasping, staring, unseeing, into the corner of the room, and began to sob, wiping her hands over and over again on the front of the T-shirt in which she had slept. She tried to get out of bed, but her legs were shaking from the dream, from the drugs he gave her, whatever the hell they were. She let herself fall onto the carpeted floor and curled into a ball. She saw herself do this. "I am now assuming the fetal position," she remarked in her head. She tried again to figure out when people would start wondering where she was. She was on holiday from the library. She wasn't expected at Shady Acres for days and days, and when she didn't show up, her mother would assume she'd just forgotten. Helen Mitchell would be a martyr for a day or two, expecting an apologetic phone call, and when one didn't come, finally she'd bring herself to call Cassandra. But how long would she wait? And then there was Karl. Oh, God, tears again. She ached for him, reached for him, spoke to him through the ether. "Help me, I love you, help me." The night before he left, she'd looked up from her book and recognized the degree of her contentment. Propped up on pillows, her bedside radio playing softly, Karl sleeping beside her, the cats curled up at the foot of the bed, she had acknowledged that she was already missing him, and was deliciously aware of how happy she would be when he came home. This, she had thought, is as good as it gets. On the floor in Gordon Murphy's guest bedroom, her cheek against the carpet, knees up to her chin, Cassandra felt a tiny dribble of anger, timid and tentative. She pictured herself in some woods somewhere on a cold, cold day, kneeling in front of a pile of dry leaves and twigs, rubbing 2 stones together. Would that work, she thought? "Don't distract me," she told herself. She imagined this, imagined that a small spark appeared, and imagined herself breathing upon it, encouraging it to grow, soft puffs of her breath tenderly applied to the spark that was anger. The trick was to get it big enough to make her strong, but not so big that she couldn't control it. The music started, billowing into her room from a speaker in the corner. The music helped the anger grow. Cassandra clambered to her feet and walked unsteadily into the bathroom to wash, to comb her hair, to prepare for the day. She would keep her anger on a shelf in her mind, folded like a long velvet skirt. It was deep red in color, an appropriate shade for anger. She folded it, placed it on the shelf, ran her hand lovingly along its length. Back in the bedroom she dressed and sat in the easy-chair waiting for breakfast, her hands flat on the arms of the chair. Gordon Murphy arrived a few minutes later. He knocked lightly on the door, unlocked it, and entered, carrying a tray. "Porridge today," he said. Cassandra noticed that his expression was grim and tried to interpret this. Was it in her best interests that he be grim? How could she use his being grim to her advantage? Was he preoccupied? With something else? Was he getting tired of her, ready to let her go? "How the hell can he let you go, idiot? You'd charge the bastard with kidnapping, and I'm pretty sure he knows that." It had, of course, occurred to her that these moments, the breakfast moments, offered her the best opportunity for escape. She would only have to overpower him, smack him over the head or something. But she'd gone through the bedroom and the bathroom with scrupulous care, and had found nothing that could serve as a weapon. Maybe a dresser drawer, she thought, but couldn't see herself keeping such a thing hidden. And the gaping hole in the dresser would be obvious to him the minute he opened the door. There wasn't anything on the food trays either. The dishes were plastic. Maybe not plastic, but something unbreakable anyway. Even the cutlery. It wasn't fair, Cassandra thought resentfully, watching as he approached her chair. He had had all the time he needed to prepare for this. She had had no time at all. "And some toast and marmalade," he said. "I hate marmalade." His hand moved so quickly she didn't even see it, just felt the slap. She thought for an instant that her head had been dislocated from her neck. I hadn't known that was possible, she thought, amazed, and placed her palm against her cheek, where the pain bloomed like a flower in time-lapse photography. Gordon Murphy had put the tray down on the desk and was staring at her truculently. Cassandra, with an effort, turned her head to look at him straight on. Her whole head, she thought, must have swollen up like a pumpkin. "Pumpkinhead, that's me." "If you hit me again, you son of a bitch," she said calmly, clearly, "you can kiss your dreams goodbye." She and Gordon Murphy stared at each other for a moment. Cassandra wanted desperately to be outside. There wasn't enough air in this room. "I hate marmalade," she said. "I also hate Wagner. I want you to get rid of the marmalade and turn off the Wagner." "Oh, you do you?" "I do. And then I want you to show me your photograph albums. I presume you have photograph albums." "I'm blithering," she thought. "Maybe dithering. Shut up." His forehead creased. He looked suspicious and perplexed. Taken aback. Good, thought Cassandra. The more aback he's taken, the better off I'll be. "Why?" he said. "I want to have a look at your family. Your genes." "My genes?" He smiled a little as he turned and went to the door. "I might have changed my mind," he said absently. "You might be too old." He looked back over his shoulder. "Too used." "Fine," said Cassandra, whose heart was hammering in accompaniment to the throbbing in her head. She tried to sound cheerful and confident. "Then I'll be on my way." She didn't stand up, though. She couldn't have stood up. "Not yet," he said. "Eat your breakfast. I have to think." He left the room, and she heard him lock the door. He went directly to his gym. He was wearing dark blue today, navy blue gym shorts, sweatshirt, socks, and training shoes. He got on the treadmill first, warming up, walking, and set the timer for 5 minutes when he'd start to jog. He was beginning to feel elated. He had thought when he struck her that it was another no-go, but then that amazing thing happened. She hadn't wept or pleaded. She had looked at him with anger and contempt. So it had turned out to be not an act of violence at all, but a test. And had she passed? Had she passed? He resolved to remain calm, not to let his excitement grow just yet. He had to keep things under control, keep himself and the situation under control. "Divine loves her man," Jean Genet had written. "She bakes pies for him and butters his roasts. She even dreams of him if he is on the toilet. She worships him in any and all positions." Gordon Murphy imagined Cassandra sitting over there in the massage chair, smiling indulgently, watching him. She'd be leaning forward a bit, her hands linked around her crossed legs, and she'd be wearing a very short skirt and a top with a low neck that permitted him to see the beginnings of her breasts, and her hair would be long, tied up on the top of her head with a red ribbon. Her hair was short, though, but it would grow. The timer went off. Gordon Murphy set it for 10 minutes this time and began a slow jog. He kept on jogging while he pulled off his sweatshirt and tossed it to the floor. From the massage chair he heard Cassandra catch her breath. He glanced at himself in the mirror. God, he looked good. Tanned, strong, healthy. Unlike a lot of men who worked out, he hadn't neglected his legs. His thighs and calves were gratifyingly muscular. His hair was thick. His nose was perhaps slightly too large. He wondered if Cassandra thought so. He'd been giving some thought lately to having surgery. He hated the idea of knives working on his face, but he might go for a consultation, see what the guy had to say for himself and his procedures. Sweat had broken out on his face and body. He stretched as he jogged, pulling in his stomach muscles, pushing back his shoulders, and thought about Cassandra over there in the massage chair, having a hard time keeping away from him. He thought about her getting up and coming over to the treadmill, slipping off her shoes and skirt and top, revealing the leotard beneath, the kind that provides nothing but a thong between the legs and no leggings with it either. She'd get up behind him on the treadmill. He could feel her presence there, smell her perfume, and now he felt her breasts against his back, jiggling as she jogged, keeping up with him. Her hands were on his waist, moving around to the front, down into his shorts. Gordon Murphy, hanging on to the treadmill handles, couldn't keep up with the moving surface beneath his feet. He turned the treadmill off and thrust his hand down there where Cassandra's hand wasn't. Jerk, 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 he said, and when he was finished he shook his head. It was only my workout clothes this time, he said to himself. Ronnie drove slowly past the house Monday morning, expecting to see her car outside, but it wasn't there. He parked in Gibson's and went into a place across from the bookstore for a coffee. He was supposed to go see a guy who had black Labrador Retriever puppies for sale, but Ronnie was rattled not to see the librarian's car in front of her house. Finally he called the guy and told him he'd be later than he'd said, and he walked up the hill and turned down the side street, through the gate and into the staff sergeant's backyard. He wasn't worried about being seen. If anybody saw him, he could pretend to be a guy come to cut the lawn. which could have used it too, now that he had a look at it in daylight. But nobody would see him. The neighbor's house was empty, there was a vacant lot across the street, and the garage blocked the view of the people who lived in the house behind this one. Ronnie pulled on his gloves, mounted the steps, and went in through the sun porch. He found everything as he had left it, except that the cat's dishes were empty again. They didn't seem interested in the fact that he'd returned. One of them was playing with a ball of aluminum foil, and the other one was lying on the sofa. She opened one eye and gazed at Ronnie for a second, then drifted back into sleep. Ronnie got down on the floor next to the wing-back chair and pulled the handbag from where it sat between the chair and the table leg. He unclasped it and looked inside. There was a keychain, but when he examined the keys on it, he saw that none was for an automobile. Maybe she kept her car keys separate, he thought. He poked around in there. A brush, a wallet, a notebook with a ballpoint pen clipped to it, an envelope, a package of lifesavers, a day timer. He removed this and leafed through the pages. Shit. She'd taken her car to Warren's shop on Friday. That's why there weren't any car keys here. And she'd drawn a line through dinner with Mom. Ronnie sat back on his heels, thinking. Then he went back into the handbag, drew out the envelope, and pulled from it a handwritten letter. Cassandra, it began. Ronnie knew from hearing it in the library that that was the librarian's first name. I think you will agree that you have encouraged my interest. I am not easily dissuaded. You deprive yourself of unimaginable joy. Please abandon this quixotic behavior. And it was signed Gordon. Ronnie's face, he could feel it, was all round eyes and open mouth. Gordon Murphy was printed at the top of this extraordinary letter, plus a Vancouver address and phone number. Ronnie read it again, and again. When one of the cats brushed suddenly against his thigh, he nearly jumped out of his skin. He was full of confusion and resolve. He read the letter one more time and memorized the address and the telephone number. Then he folded it, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the handbag, and pushed the bag carefully back into the space between the chair and the table leg. He got to his feet and looked down at the handbag from several angles. Then he reached down and pulled it out a little bit, so it would be more visible. There might not be anything wrong, but he was pretty sure there was. Before he left, he fed the cats again. He put this empty can and the one from yesterday into a plastic grocery bag that he found in a kitchen drawer and took them away with him. Down the hill in Gibson's he found a trash barrel for the cat food cans. Whatever was wrong, it might not have anything to do with this guy in Vancouver who'd written her the weird letter. But it would take only, say, 3 hours, 4 hours tops to check this guy out. Ronnie got into the Toyota and drove to the Langdale Ferry Terminal. Chapter 26. It was late morning when Alberg arrived back in Seashelt. Winifred's neighborhood, he thought, looked more like a county fair than a crime scene. Naomi was sitting in a lawn chair, which she told him later she had borrowed from the drug addict next door. She had set it up in the middle of the street, just outside the yellow tape that had been strung around Winifred's house and yard. Among the crowd that had gathered were people drinking coffee or pop or beer, people taking pictures, people eating potato chips or hot dogs or chewing gum. They sat on lawns or leaned against tree trunks or stood with their weight on one foot, their arms folded. They looked through sunglasses, from under visors, and around other people who were closer to the scene than they. They were being warily observed by several police officers, but they weren't an excited crowd. Curious, of course, but mostly bemused. "I want my kids to see me if they look out the window," Alberg heard Naomi tell Jack Duggan. "Why the hell should I move? That's a sword she's got in there, not a gun, for God's sake. She can't get at me unless she comes charging out of there, which is what I wanted to do anyway." She turned to address the crowd. "That's a crazy woman in there," she said, speaking very loudly. Alberg knew that Winifred could probably hear her through the open windows in the living room and the kitchen. "A crazy person who's a kidnapper." "I don't think you should try to make her mad," said Corporal Duggan uneasily. "Well, I do," said Naomi, furious. "I told you I want to make her charge out of there at me." "But what if she turns on your kids instead?" said Duggan. "She already speared your husband, right?" Naomi looked at him. He was crouched next to the lawn chair, speaking softly. "Deranged people are not predictable." "He's right, Naomi," said Alberg. He looked up the walk at the house. "What's the situation, Jack?" "This has been going on for almost 24 hours now, Staff," said Duggan. He stood up. "The kid's father came to the house, said he was going to take them away. She said no way. He was hollering, banging on the door. So she poked him with this sword, and he falls on her porch screaming. The next-door neighbor over there called us. Turns out it's this Keith Hellier guy we've been looking for." "How bad is he?" "Oh, hell," the constable laughed. "Not bad. It's just a scratch, really. We've got him in custody for 24 hours. We'll get busy checking his house and his truck for evidence in the Kaczynski thing." He gestured toward Winifred's house. "As soon as we can wind things up here." "The damn druggie," said Naomi with contempt, staring at Winifred's front door. "Cokehead. Dragged off to jail. Good riddance, I say. She was right not to let him have my damn kids, but now she won't let me have them either." "Why not?" said Alberg. "She's turned out to be crazy, that's why," said Naomi, glaring at him. She looked moodily at the house again. "I should have never come to stay in her damned guest room." "Did anybody try to get her on the phone?" "Yes," said Duggan. "She doesn't answer, and she won't let anybody get close to the house." Alberg sighed and started slowly up the walk. "Stop right where you are, Karl," Winifred called out. Alberg stopped, took his hands from his pockets and held them up, palms out. "What's going on here, Winifred?" "Neither of them is a fit parent, so I'm pondering what to do about that." "Are the children okay?" "Of course they're okay, for heaven's sake. That's what this is all about." "I'd like to talk to you, Winifred." "Well, I don't want to talk to you." Ronnie was on the ferry when he decided he had to call the police. Sure, it could be nothing at all. She could have turned up back home safe and sound while Ronnie was driving to the ferry, or that could be happening this very minute. On the other hand, she could be in a lot of trouble, and it was Ronnie's responsibility to let the police know about it. He had to stand in a line-up for the phone, and was for a while worried that they'd get to Horseshoe Bay before it was his turn. But soon there were only 3 people ahead of him, and then 2, and then it was Ronnie's turn. Fortunately, the person behind him, a teenaged kid, had a bunch of friends with him, and they were all talking and laughing together and not interested in Ronnie's phone call. He had to get the number from information. He dialed it, and a female voice said, "Seashelt RCMP." Ronnie talked in a very quiet voice and made it deeper than his normal one. "I've got some information for you," he said. "Just a second, I'll get an officer." "No," said Ronnie quickly, "I don't want an officer. Listen, it's got to do with the staff sergeant. Something funny's happened at his house." "Who is this?" "Never mind. You got to take this seriously, ma'am. Send somebody over there to have a look. Quick." He hesitated and then hung up. Ronnie made his way in the middle of a crowd down to car deck A. They'd announced that the ferry was nearing the terminal. He found the Toyota, unlocked the door, and climbed in. What the hell did he plan to do when he got to this place, he asked himself, hands on the steering wheel, gazing through the windshield at the tourists, trying to remember where they'd left their vehicles. He flexed his hands and flexed them again, and a torrent of possibilities flooded his mind. He'd find that no such address existed, or else it had been burned to the ground, or there'd be an ambulance in front when he got there, and he'd see the librarian lying on a gurney, and he'd see somebody covering her face with a sheet. Ronnie shuddered. He tried to work out the likely course of events if the police did go to her house and did get alarmed, like Ronnie had. They would want the guy who wrote the letter checked out, wouldn't they? And they'd probably get the Vancouver police to do it, because that would be faster. Even so, Ronnie thought, as the ferry eased against the dock, he would probably get there first. But he could hold the fort for a while, he thought staunchly. Sure he could. "Do you need anything?" Alberg asked Winifred about half an hour later. "Food? Anything?" "I need you to get off my sidewalk." "Staff Sergeant?" He turned to see Alistair McNeil waving at him from behind the yellow tape. He walked over to him. "Would it be all right if I tried?" said McNeil. With his peripheral vision, Alberg saw Isabella slipping rapidly through the crowd toward him. He had a sudden image of Sid Sokolovsky sitting alone in a darkened house, lifting his service revolver, blowing himself away. He stared at Winifred's front door, painted yellow to match the new siding, and he couldn't get apprehension for Sokolovsky out of his head. It had rooted there, pervasive and malevolent. "Yeah, go ahead," he said to McNeil, and the man slipped under the tape. "Stop right there," said Winifred sharply. "Call her twins," said Naomi suddenly. "Let me have my say," said McNeil to Winifred. "I'll be brief." He glanced behind him at the crowd and lowered his voice somewhat. "We got off on the wrong foot, you and me." Alberg turned and searched the crowd for Isabella, and there she was, emerging from behind a portly man wearing a straw hat and eating an ice cream cone. "You looked at me standing there talking about garden services," said Alistair McNeil, "and I was a man of about your husband's age, and I was alive, and he had just died. I think that's what it was, Mrs. Gartner, that got us off on the wrong foot." "Her damn twins," said Naomi impatiently. Alberg stared at Isabella, trying to read her face. Then he turned back to watch McNeil. "Mrs. Gartner, you need somebody to talk to about this situation," said Alistair, "and I'm him." "Call her damn twins," said Naomi, tugging at Alberg's sleeve. "In Vancouver. They'll come over, talk some sense into her." Winifred's front door slowly opened. She pushed 2 swords onto her porch. Alistair McNeil mounted the steps and went inside. "What twins?" said Alberg to Naomi. "Winifred doesn't have any twins." Isabella, hurrying toward him, was looking into his face. "Is it Sid?" "No, Karl, it looks like there's something wrong at your house." Why did she die? Cassandra had asked her mother. She was 6. Old age? This was incredible. Cassandra knew trees that were older than her grandmother. This was incredible, too, to be snatched away by a sex-mad, crazy person. It was ridiculous. He hadn't come to her room all day. She didn't have a watch or a clock, but she figured from the way the light entered through the skylight that it was afternoon. Good luck, they had chorused, the friends who'd given her a moving-in-together shower, wishing her luck, as if she'd been setting out to swim the English Channel. Cassandra badly wanted to have a plan. So far she had none. She was feeling somewhat more alert today, which confirmed her suspicion that the madman was mixing some damn drug into her food. She'd been eating as little as possible and drinking a lot of water in the hope of flushing it out of her system, and this seemed to be working. "I'll call you," she'd shouted, waving vigorously as he motored out of the harbor. He waved back, grinning hugely. She thought his sailboat looked perilously small. She got up from the armchair and did some stretching exercises and then some sit-ups, but after 5 sit-ups she was feeling weak and dizzy, so she decided that was a bad idea. He must have wondered why she hadn't phoned. Maybe he thought she'd forgotten how to get the marine operator. He would have called her, finally. Surely he would have. When was it that he left anyway? How many days ago? Incarceration was a hell of a life, she thought, wandering through her cramped quarters, touching each wall in turn with the tips of her fingers. You were either scared out of your mind or bored to tears. Nothing to read, no television to watch. Her only hope was to get him to trust her enough to let her out into the rest of the house, and then to make a break for it. She saw herself pelting down his driveway, the madman at her heels. If she yelled and screamed, would Shaughnessy listen? Would Shaughnessy care? Or would Shaughnessy ignore her unseemly outburst and go about its business as usual? Her mother wouldn't expect to see her until Friday, but Cassandra usually called her several times a week. Maybe she was even now sitting in Shady Acres, brooding about Cassandra's forgetfulness, but too proud to complain. "Complain, Mother," Cassandra said aloud. "Complain, for God's sake." A seagull was scrabbling on the skylight, trying to grab hold. Cassandra was tempted to see it as a messenger from Karl. She resisted this, though. She didn't like to think of herself as a fanciful or a sentimental person. Sentimentality had been expunged by the decades of her life. She wondered how he would react, this madman, if she told him she was menopausal. What was likely to happen to her anyway? Her heart rose in her chest, then plummeted like a wounded elevator. She was dozing in the chair when she heard the key in the lock. The door flew open, and the madman stood there, filling the doorway, holding a tray which he deposited on the coffee table in front of her. It was hard to judge his mood, even though he was smiling. Not at her, just smiling. He went back into the hall and picked something up from the floor, then returned, closing the door behind him. With a gesture vaguely theatrical, he tossed a photo album on the table next to the tray. He was wearing jeans and a white sweatshirt, and yet again sneakers without socks. Cassandra looked down at the album. "Good. Let's have a look." She opened to the first page, which held an 8x10 glossy of Gordon Murphy in graduation robes. So did the next page, a picture for each degree. "I think you should eat first." He squatted next to the coffee table and took a mug of soup from the tray. "Campbell's tomato, and a piece of cheese bread to go with it." "That's very kind of you. I'm actually very hungry." She lifted the mug to her mouth. "Ouch! Hot. I'll let it cool for a minute," she said, giving him a smile. "This is an excellent picture of you," she said approvingly, tapping the album, which was an old one, Cassandra now noticed, with black pages, thick and fuzzy, almost like heavy blotting paper. She saw gashes where things had been snicked away, and remembered albums belonging to her mother, with tiny triangular pockets designed to contain the photograph's corners. Cassandra turned the page. The shock of what she saw kept her still and silent, desperate not to move or speak. She felt his eyes on the side of her face. He was still crouched down, level with her. Cassandra's fingers moved hesitantly through the air toward first the left-hand page, then the right. "My goodness," she said, "what beautiful women." The one on the left was in her 30s, smiling at the camera, wearing a bronze silk shirt and a pair of lilac silk pants, apparently sewing a pillow. The picture was an irregular shape, the background having been cut out. "My mother," said Gordon. "And over there," he said, pointing to the opposite page, "my sister." She was about 18, with long wavy hair, and she was sitting on a bench in front of a bed of tall pink flowers. This picture was perhaps 4 inches square. Both had been carefully cut from magazines and taped into the album. Gordon Murphy reached out and turned the page. "I don't have a separate picture of my brother, but here's the 3 of us together." This one showed a girl of about 6, also with long, wavy hair, standing between 2 boys who were older, a blonde about 8 and a taller, dark-haired boy of 10 or 12. "Goodness," said Cassandra. She was acutely aware of his presence. She concentrated on the pictures. He chuckled, pointing. "This is one of my favorites. My dad," he said fondly. A balding man in his 50s, on a bench, surrounded by larkspur. "And here's the family home," he said, turning another page. A chunk had been carefully removed from the middle, where there had probably been type. The picture showed the front of a white house with lattices covered with roses, a round table on a flagstone patio, and hollyhocks growing along a fence. "And finally," he said proudly, flicking another page, "here, you want to see jeans? How are these for jeans?" 5 black and white photos reproduced in the pages of another magazine. 2 oval, 2 rectangular, 1 square, all from the last century. A man with wild hair holding a violin, a grim-faced young woman, full-lipped, with thick hair piled on top of her head, an old woman wearing a shawl over her head and shoulders, and a black dress and black gloves. A family portrait, dour parents and 3 bored children, and a bearded man whose eyes still blazed. None of them looked happy about having been purloined to serve as Gordon Murphy's ancestors. He slapped the album shut and stood up. He leaned against the door jamb and folded his arms. Cassandra was looking at the front of the album and nodding to herself. "Speak," said Gordon. She looked up. He was expressionless. "I'm wondering why you did it," she said. He didn't respond. "You must have a real family. Everyone does. So I guess they don't meet your expectations. So you decided to invent another one." She opened her eyes wide. "That is an extremely creative act." He continued to look blank, vacant. "I approve of your choices, too, very much. Although, if I may," he nodded, "I think that your garden, the one here, is quite a bit more beautiful than the one in the picture. Of the family home." He continued to study her. She felt very much like a laboratory specimen. Suddenly he squatted down in front of her, moving swiftly, taking her by surprise so that her heart lurched. He stared intently into her eyes. "I cannot decide," he said slowly, "whether you are bullshitting me or not." Cassandra looked back at him, trying hard to appear direct and honest and dignified. Trustworthy. Chapter 27. Alberg couldn't park directly in front of his house because there was a patrol car there. He pulled in behind it, got out of his Oldsmobile, and closed the door. He watched himself do this, saw his hand on the edge of the door, saw it push the door closed, heard the thwacking sound, looked intently at his hand, which was reddish-brown from the sun. Across the street, George Peterson was out in his front yard, leaning on something, a rake maybe, and he was staring openly at Alberg. George cocked his head questioningly. Alberg looked back at him, and remembered his father's funeral and how much food there had been. He imagined George and his wife, whose name Alberg had temporarily forgotten, trotting across the street toward his house, laden with casseroles and cakes. He walked past the patrol car, in which he saw Norman McIntyre talking into the radio. He went through the front gate in his new fence, and along the newly repaired walk and into his house. Nora Gibbons stood just inside the door. "Is McIntyre calling the Gibsons' detachment?" said Alberg. "Yes, he is, Staff." Alberg stepped along the short hallway and stopped and looked around. "Have you seen my cats?" "Yes, Staff," said the constable. "They went outside when we came in. I hope that's okay." The caller had said something funny had happened. Isabella said he'd sounded concerned. "Was the door locked when you got here?" said Alberg, looking at the overturned ottoman. He felt frustrated, acutely impatient. "No, it wasn't, Staff." He saw the glass sitting in a puddle on the end table. Maybe it was a neighbor who'd called, Isabella had suggested. Maybe it was George Peterson who'd called, Alberg thought now. What the hell could he have seen? He saw Cassandra's handbag. He strode across the room and reached for it, hesitated. Was he in the middle of a fucking crime scene or not? "Get me some gloves, please, Nora," he said, crouching down in front of the chair. The handbag was the one he had given her, a bag with shape and substance to it, not one of those big, limp, over-the-shoulder things. Nora Gibbons handed him a pair of disposable gloves, and he put them on, pulled the handbag out, and opened it. Minutes later he dropped the letter and stood, his heart hammering, and saw the world through a haze of pain and fury. He made his way out of the house, stumbling through the kitchen and the sun porch, and down the stairs to stand in the middle of his backyard. He stripped the gloves from his hands and let them fall to the ground. He couldn't think. He felt like he was in the middle of a hurricane. "Karl!" Alberg didn't move. "Jesus, Sid," he said, "I don't know what's going on here." The sergeant came into his field of vision. "I'll phone the guy. His number's on there." A jolt went through Alberg, leaving him breathless. "No," he said, "I'll phone him." He sprinted across the yard and up the steps, consumed with the need to hear Gordon Murphy's voice. He got an answering machine. Alberg listened intently. He left no message. "Sid, you call him now. I want you to hear him." The sergeant placed the call. He listened, looking out the living-room window. "He sounds like a sleazy bastard," he said when he'd hung up. He frowned, thinking. Murphy. That's Irish. He doesn't sound Irish. Not that there aren't Irish sleazebags, I guess. He glanced at the constables. "You two go on back to Seashelt now. I'll stay here and work with the Gibsons' crew when they get here." "You were sent home," said Alberg. He was in a tremendous struggle to remain calm, to get logical, methodical, in control. "You're on leave." Sokolovsky put an arm around Alberg's shoulder and walked him into the kitchen. "I can handle this, Karl. You can't. Even if you could, you can't, and you know it." "Jesus Christ, I can't just sit around doing fuck all. I don't even know what the fuck's going on here." He rubbed his temples and leaned against the counter. "She's gone. She didn't take her car. She didn't take her purse. She didn't take a coat or a jacket. She left in a hurry, and I don't know why or where she was going. She leaves behind this fucking letter, which has been torn up, which suggests she didn't like the tone of the fucking thing, but which has also been stuck together again. Which suggests what?" Christ, he was shaking. "This is what we're going to do," said Sokolovsky. "We're going to talk to everybody who knows her. We're going to collect evidence throughout the house. We're going to question the neighbors. And I'm going to get on the horn to Vancouver and have them send somebody over to talk to this Murphy guy." Alberg, staring at spilled milk on the kitchen counter, tried again to summon the cold, enigmatic side of him, the side he associated, for convenience sake, with his Scandinavian heritage. "That sounds good, Sid," he said quietly. Cassandra might not tell him, he thought, if she had become attracted to somebody else. "Yeah, okay." But she sure as hell wouldn't run off with somebody else without telling him. He pushed himself away from the counter. "I'm going to make myself scarce around here. Besides," he thought, "she was using the purse I gave her." He headed for the door to the sun porch. "Thanks, Sid," he said as he left the house. "I'll keep in touch," Sokolovsky called. "Over your car phone." He'd tell them that it was a police emergency, Alberg thought, heading for the ferry. They'd move him to the head of the line. Chapter 28. "I have been considering," said Gordon Murphy, staring into Cassandra's face, "moving on to Phase 2, or 3, or 4, or wherever we are. That is to say, I've been thinking that it might be time to offer you more space." "I'd like that," said Cassandra. She tried to look at him fondly, focusing on the scar near his right eyebrow. He brushed hair away from her forehead. "You could perhaps roam throughout the house, becoming acquainted with your new home." He leaned close and laid his lips against her cheek. "Sleeping in my bed?" He turned her head and kissed her lips. Cassandra let them open slightly and made them soft. Said Gordon Murphy. He pulled away before she did. "I'd have to turn the alarms on, of course." He studied her for a moment. "Just for the first day or so." He kissed her temple. Cassandra tried to persuade her body to relax. "I know," he said suddenly. He stood and dazzled her with his smile. "We'll have a celebration dinner. I'll cook and you'll help." "Wonderful," said Cassandra, stretching her mouth into a smile. Jesus, he thought, staring at her, exultation beginning to grow. It was going to work. He pulled her out of the chair and hugged her. With his arms around her, he said, "You haven't had a tour of the house, have you? You don't know all the wonderful stuff there is here for you. Oh, my darling, we're going to be so happy." The front door chimes sounded throughout the house. Gordon's smile faded. He tilted his head, quizzical. He could let the machine take his phone calls, but he didn't think he ought to ignore the doorbell, not with his car sitting there in the garage. He backed out of her room and locked it and made his way downstairs. Fuck! Why hadn't he locked the damn gate? Through the peephole he saw that on his doorstep stood 2 police officers. Their patrol car was in his driveway. Gordon waited until he was filled with calm. Then he opened the door. "Hello," he said, polite but questioning. "Are you Gordon Murphy?" said the older cop, who was older than Gordon and had a belly on him that didn't look healthy. "Yes, I am." "You know a woman named Cassandra Mitchell?" Gordon lifted his eyebrows. "Why, yes. Is something wrong, officer? You seen her recently?" He frowned, thinking. "Not since, late June, I guess it was. We served on a committee together." "We're just making a routine inquiry, sir," said the other cop, who was tall and young with cold eyes. "You mind if we take a look around?" "Where?" said Gordon, amazed. "Inside," said the young cop, looking behind Gordon into the house. "Inside my house? Oh, no, I don't think so." "Why? For what?" "She's missing, see," said the cop with the big belly. "Her friends are worried about her." "What the hell makes you think you'll find her here?" "Well, there was apparently a letter found." Gordon Murphy looked blank. Then he laughed. Oh, dear, oh, yes." He glanced down, then up, wearing a shame-faced expression. "I admit I found her attractive. Gee, I'd almost forgotten about this." He laughed again. "She spurned my advances, gentlemen. I try to forget such experiences just as quickly as I can." "Well, we haven't got a warrant," said the older cop. "Not yet, anyway. So we can't make you cooperate." "I'm cooperating by talking to you," said Gordon with a smile. "Sure you don't want to change your mind?" said the young cop. Gordon shook his head, still smiling, and they got in their car and drove away. He watched them crunch down his gravel driveway, stop to pull open the gate, drive through, and stop to close the gate again. Gordon closed the door and turned the keypad set into the wall. He punched in the code that set the house alarm system and then the one for the gate. Then he took the stairs at a gallop, unlocked Cassandra's door, and burst into her room. The cops were here. That was the fucking cops. He was looking at the wheelchair in the corner and the scarves that had bound her to it. They'll be back. I've got to get rid of that damn thing. Then he looked at her. Why did you have to keep that letter, you fucking bitch? I couldn't possibly not keep it, said Cassandra with an effort. It was a love letter. He stared at her for a long moment, his breath coming fast. I've got to think. He left her room, locking the door behind him. In his gym he stripped, put on shorts and a muscle shirt, and picked up his leather skipping rope. Christ, those goddamn stupid cops. It was going to work. She was going to love him and live with him. But now, they hadn't left him enough fucking time. He needed more time with her. Not much, maybe even just another 48 hours. He knew she couldn't yet be trusted to say to the cops when they returned, I am here freely of my own free will. This is the man I love. No, she would not say that yet. He knew it. But how could he know that for sure? She had been warm and loving today, hadn't she? Hadn't she demonstrated a depth of feeling and understanding that was staggering in a woman? He skipped feverishly. She had already passed a number of tests. Could he trust her? Could he? Oh, God damn it, was she going to turn into woman number 5 on him, for fuck's sake, and end up fertilizing the rose garden with Julia Garcia? But no. Oh, no, there had to be a way. And Gordon skipped and skipped until sweat ran from his forehead into his eyes and mouth. He stopped and put on a sweatband and climbed aboard his exercise bike and pedaled hard, thinking harder. The police were looking for her. Cassandra wanted to be jubilant, but this could be the most dangerous time of all. What's he thinking, she wondered. What are his alternatives? How could she persuade him, and of what exactly should she persuade him? She walked up and down in her tiny room. It was getting dark outside. Cassandra had turned on a lamp. It's been days since I've seen myself in a mirror, she thought, and her mind flitted drunkenly from one thing to another, touching on Gordon and the wheelchair and the drug he'd been giving her, on Karl and the darkening sky and the closeness of the city, on giving up, giving in, remaining brave, on making choices, taking chances, dying. She didn't know where he went when he said he had to think. Did he leave the house? Maybe he sat on the floor in a corner somewhere. Maybe in the hallway right outside her room. Maybe he was there now, right outside her room. She had been looking absently at the door for several seconds when she saw the handle turn. Oh, God, oh, no! Her heart soared and she felt nauseated. And angry. Incredibly angry. How humiliating to be so completely at the mercy of somebody else. She tried to calm herself, to steel herself for whatever crazy decision he'd come up with. The door didn't fly open, bouncing against the wall. It didn't open normally, either. It just slid open, almost soundlessly. Cassandra's gaze was riveted on this 3-inch gap. She had to do something about it. She went to the door and pulled it wide open, saying, "Gordon?" almost in a whisper. Not a sound. She stepped into the hall. "Gordon?" Nothing. She felt weak and faint, looking down the stairs that led to the second floor. She made her way down the steps, her legs trembling, her hand on the banister, cold and clammy, and stood in the second-floor hall, looking up and down. All the doors were closed. She still couldn't hear a sound. She called his name more loudly. "Gordon?" No reply. Cassandra went to the top of the next flight of stairs. From here she could see the entrance hall. She could see the front door. It was standing open. This was a test. She knew it. It was a test, and she mustn't fail it. She had to go down those stairs and across the hall, reach for the door and push it closed, and lock it, lock herself back in here with the madman. She had to do this, she thought, moving down the stairs, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. She heard nothing except her own voice, a quick, shallow whisper, saying, "Oh, God, dear God, please, God," over and over. She glided down the stairway, thinking, "He's watching me from somewhere. I cannot fail. I must not fail." Now she had reached the bottom. Now she was walking on shiny black marble, but she still made no sound as she crossed it because she was barefoot. She'd forgotten that until she felt the shock of cold marble on the soles of her feet. Through the open door Cassandra saw moths fluttering around the outside light, and a sweep of pavement encircling a flower garden, and a gravel driveway disappearing into darkness, and at the bottom of the driveway a lighted gate, standing open. Cassandra approached the front door, expecting at every second to hear his voice. "Aha," he'd say when she pushed the door closed, or "You passed," or "Oh, darling, you do love me." She reached for the doorknob, sobbing now, knowing she had to do it. Cassandra bolted through the doorway, down the gravel driveway, and through the gate. Weeping and staggering, she propelled herself to the end of the block and around the corner, and saw a Mercedes gliding onto the street from a driveway 50 feet away. Cassandra screamed, waving her arms. The Mercedes stopped, then started driving away. Cassandra screamed louder, pelting down the street toward its tail lights, and the Mercedes stopped once more. The passenger door opened and a woman got out. Then the driver, another woman. They stood, hesitant, glancing uneasily across the roof of the car at one another, then at Cassandra. They stood firm, though, waiting for Cassandra. Less than half an hour later, Sid Sokolovsky called Alberg. "I just talked to her, Karl. She's fine." He told Alberg where to find her. Vancouver police, he said, were on their way to pick up Gordon Murphy. Alberg pulled over. He rested his forehead on the steering wheel. He was weak and trembling from the relief that flooded through him. He realized that he was only blocks from the address Sokolovsky had given him, only blocks from Cassandra, only blocks, too, from Gordon Murphy. The son of a bitch might get away, he told himself. Gordon Murphy got off the bike, his heart pounding, and wiped sweat from his face and body. "You're going to kill yourself with all this fitness shit," he said out loud, and gulped bottled water from the small refrigerator next to the bathroom. How much time did he have until he could expect the cops back? How long does it take to get a warrant anyway? They didn't have much. They had fuck all, he told himself. Probably not enough to get a fucking warrant. So what should he do? He tried to think. He positioned himself at the rowing machine and began to pull. Get rid of the wheelchair, probably, he thought, breathless. Though maybe not. He could tell them it was for his aged mother. He sputtered some laughter. His aged mother, who wasn't aged and probably wasn't his mother. The world was filled with nothing but lies. But what about the woman? What about the fucking woman, the woman who was supposed to be his life partner, his fucking other half? Gordon turned and stared. He stumbled to his feet. His brain must be short-circuiting. "How did you—" He was panting. His voice was harsh, like noises made by broken glass. "Get in here." "The front door's open," said Alberg. "Open?" He looked wildly behind Alberg into the basement. "Yeah," said Alberg. The guy was drenched with sweat, dressed in shorts that offered a good view of his genitals, and a T-shirt that practically didn't exist. His black hair dripped sweat. His grey chest hair was matted with it. Gordon walked unsteadily to a bench that sat against the wall and picked up a towel. He dried himself with it. "You have her, I take it?" "She's gone," said Alberg. "Yeah." Gordon laughed. His laugh sounded as good as ever. He was getting himself back under control. His mind was working sharp and fast like laser beams. He sat on the bench and looked him over. The Mountie. Pale, blonde, clearly a man of little emotion. Gordon felt disinterested, gazing at him. "And what did she tell you went on here between us?" Alberg didn't reply. Gordon Murphy tossed the towel onto the bench and walked toward Alberg, who stepped between him and the door. "Are you planning to arrest me?" Alberg shook his head. "Then what the fuck are you doing here?" "I came to get a look at you, before they take you away." Gordon Murphy said, "Nobody's taking me anywhere, you idiot. Nobody's going to listen to the ravings of a hysterical, middle-aged woman." Alberg couldn't take his eyes off the guy's teeth. He argued with himself half-heartedly. Then, what the hell, he thought. I can always take early retirement. And he nailed him right in the mouth. Chapter 29. Once the swords had appeared on Winifred Gartner's porch, and Alistair MacNeil had been admitted into her house, community interest dwindled. The crowd broke apart and began trickling away. Alistair MacNeil remained inside for several hours. At dusk, lights were turned on, and Alistair and Winifred and the 2 children could be seen through the living-room window. The children were sprawled on the carpet watching television. Alistair was on the sofa, and Winifred sat straight and tall in an easy-chair. Alistair was leaning forward, talking, and Winifred was apparently listening to him. Naomi, squinting in at them from her lawn chair, roused herself from a sullen silence. "It's time my kids had dinner. I want my damn kids. Just look at them in there, ignoring us, for God's sake." Jack Duggan thought it looked like a stage set. And the people looked like actors, too. Winifred wearing a blue costume covered with a big orange bird, and Alistair in his olive coveralls. The constable was curious about what Alistair might be saying to Winifred. He looked at the swords lying on the porch and stared once more through Winifred's living-room window. Then he went up the walk and pounded on the door. Winifred opened it and said, "I'm sorry for all the trouble." Naomi bounded from the lawn chair, over the yellow tape, and up onto the porch. "You're not actually a bad mother," Winifred said to her, as Tiffany and Walter ran into the hall. "You can take your kids, or you can come in if you want." "Are you going to get crazy and violent again?" said Naomi severely, pulling her children close to her. "Because I've had my fill of that in my damn life." "No, no," said Winifred, pressing a hand against her forehead. "It was just some kind of spasm. It's over now." "It may be over, Winifred," said Jack Duggan, "but you're going to have to come down to the detachment with me. There's paperwork from hell waiting for us there." "I didn't mean to poke him," said Winifred. "I only meant to threaten him." "Yeah, well, that's illegal, too." "Except it turned out that the asshole Keith was a wanted man," said Naomi, stroking Tiffany's hair. "That ought to make a difference." The constable thought this over. "Maybe," he said, nodding. Alistair MacNeil emerged from around the corner. "I'll come with you." Winifred turned and looked at him gravely. "That won't be necessary." She picked up her handbag from the hall table. "I very much appreciate your kindness and your advice. It's good advice, and I'll take it. But enough is enough. You fix those kids some supper," she said to Naomi, going out the door. "I'll phone you if they put me in jail." "Will I be able to do that?" she asked Jack Duggan as they went down the walk toward his patrol car. "We're not going to put you in jail, Winifred." "But if you do, I read that in Canada we don't necessarily get to make a phone call. Is that true?" "I promise you, Winifred, I personally promise you," said the constable, opening the car door, "that if we put you in jail, we'll let you make a phone call. Get in." "Don't be silly. I'm not sitting in the front seat. I go in the back, behind the bars, with the doors that don't open from the inside, because I'm a criminal." "Winifred, get in." "I don't know what came over me." "I know, Winifred." "Hey, it's going to be okay." "I really think you should put me in the back seat." The constable leaned on the roof of the patrol car. "Earlier today," he said, "I picked up Ray Barfield. He was staggering along the highway down by Davis Bay, drunk as a skunk." "Huh," said Winifred disapprovingly. "Put him in the back. I thought he might fall out if I put him in the front." Winifred nodded. "He threw up, made a hell of a mess in there, and I haven't had a chance to clean it up real good yet." He grinned at her. "Hop in," he said, holding the front passenger door open wide. So Winifred got in. "You're in trouble, aren't you?" said Cassandra the next day, "because you hit him." "What the hell?" Alberg shrugged. Gently she touched his right hand. They were sitting side by side on the sofa, watching the summer afternoon through the living-room window. The hydrangeas were bursts of blue along the cedar fence. The front door was open, and the cats had arranged themselves across the threshold. "He's a madman, Karl." She prodded her psyche cautiously. She didn't know yet how damaged it might be. "I wanted to go in there on a horse," he said, "or a motorcycle, wearing the red serge." He tried to laugh. "Like Nelson Eddy, to rescue you." She kissed the swollen knuckles. Hitting wouldn't have been enough for her. She wished she'd been able to wield the axe named Thunder against Gordon Murphy, or at least shoot him dead with a gun. "But you were already rescued," he said. "Yes," said Cassandra, frowning. "That was pretty damn peculiar, wasn't it?" "Apparently," said Isabella confidentially to Sid Sokolovsky, "that old guy Dutton's got a case. You know, about us owing him rent." "What?" "Yeah, so I heard. His lawyer—" "Stop, don't." He backed toward the door. "I'm not listening to this. Save it for Karl. I'm going home." "Sergeant, are you okay?" "No." He rubbed his head and put his service cap on. "But maybe someday." When he had gone, Isabella turned back to her computer screen. A few minutes later she heard the door open and looked up. "Is that dog housebroken?" she said. Ronnie Plankton laughed. "No, not yet. He's only 12 weeks old, but he just went outside. I was wondering if I could see the person in charge." "That'll be Corporal Michelson just at the moment," said Isabella. She summoned Mike, who expressed interest in Ronnie's dog because he was thinking of buying a pet for his 5-year-old. "He's a Labrador retriever," said Ronnie. "His name is Phoenix." When they'd finished talking about dogs, Mike said, "Now, are you here to report a theft by any chance?" Ronnie, startled, said that he was not. "Oh," said Mike, obviously disappointed. "Okay, what can I do for you then?" "I was wondering," said Ronnie, "if you could tell me how I go about applying to join the Mounties." This concludes A Touch of Panic by L.R. Wright. Narrated by Marion Dennis Brown. Monitored by Margaret Ball, Diane Elder, Esther Lipman, Pam Cumming, Betty Bates, Elizabeth Easterbrook, and Jean Stevens. Completed August 1994